Tonight, we're diving into the whole long story of Harry Potter, told gently from beginning to end, the way a story should be told to someone who is drifting towards sleep. This is the story you may already know by heart, and that is exactly why it is such a soft place to rest. A tale of a boy left on a doorstep with a lightning scar, of a hidden world of castles and owls and moving staircases, and of a quiet, patient courage that carried him from a cupboard under the stairs all the way to peace. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow him without haste through 7 long years, through the discovery that he was a wizard, through friendships that would last a lifetime, through dark forests and enchanted halls, through loss and through wonder, and at last through a gentle dawn on the far side of the war. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down towards sleep. On a quiet night in the autumn of 1981, in a small village called Godric's Hollow, a young family lived behind the walls of a modest cottage, hidden away from a world that had grown very dark. James Potter and Lily Potter were their names, and they were wizard and witch. Though they lived gently, without show, cradling between them a son not yet fully grown out of infancy. His name was Harry. He was a bright-eyed child with a soft cap of black hair, and he had known, in his short life, nothing but warmth and lullabies, and the comfort of 2 people who loved him more than they loved their own safety. Beyond that cottage, a terrible shadow had been spreading across the wizarding world for many years. A dark wizard had risen, more powerful and more feared than any before him, and his name was so dreaded that most people would not say it aloud, calling him instead only he who must not be named. He gathered followers who wore hoods and masks, and he spread fear the way winter spreads frost, slowly, silently, until it seemed nothing could ever be warm again. The Potters had defied him. They had chosen, again and again, to stand against him, and so on that November night, drawn by dark purpose, he came at last to Godric's Hollow to find them. He entered the cottage without knocking, for such courtesies were nothing to him. James stood between the wizard and his family, unarmed, buying with his own life the seconds his wife would need. He fell first, without ever raising a wand in defense. Then the dark wizard climbed the narrow stairs to the nursery, where Lily stood before the crib, refusing to step aside. She was offered mercy if she would only move, and she would not. She wrapped her arms around the idea of her son and let herself fall so that he might live. And in that choice, though no one there understood it yet, a very old and very deep magic was quietly born. When the dark wizard turned his wand upon the child, something happened that had never happened before. The killing curse, which had ended so many lives without fail, struck the baby and rebounded, turning back upon the one who had cast it. The love that Lily had poured out in her final moment lay upon her son like an invisible shield, and the curse could not pass through it. The dark wizard was torn from his body in an instant, reduced to something less than a ghost, a mere wisp of ruined spirit that fled into the night. And where the curse had touched the child's forehead, it left only a small mark, a thin scar in the shape of a lightning bolt, the single trace of a night that should have destroyed him. The house was broken and silent now, wrapped in smoke and the smell of ruin, and the baby cried alone in the wreckage. Yet far away, others already knew what had come to pass. A great motorcycle descended out of the clouds, and upon it sat a giant of a man named Rubeus Hagrid. keeper of keys and grounds at a school called Hogwarts, his beetle black eyes swollen with tears. Gently, with hands large enough to cradle the child completely, he lifted Harry from the rubble and carried him up into the cold night sky, away from the only home the boy would never remember. They flew through the darkness to a very ordinary street in a very ordinary town, a place called Privet Drive, where the houses stood in tidy rows and the lawns were trimmed to matching lengths. There, beneath a sky scattered with stars, 3 figures gathered upon the pavement. An elderly wizard with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts, dimmed the street lamps one by one with a strange silver device until the whole road lay in shadow. Beside him stood a stern witch named Minerva McGonagall, who had waited all day in the shape of a cat, watching the family that lived at number 4. And Hagrid arrived with the sleeping child in his arms, and the parting was a heavy one. Dumbledore had made a decision that would shape all the years to come. Harry would be left with his mother's sister and her husband, the only living family he had, so that the old magic of his mother's sacrifice might continue to protect him within their home. The 2 grown-ups who awaited him inside were named Vernon and Petunia Dursley, and they were as unmagical and as unwilling as any people could be. Dumbledore knew they would not love the boy. He knew the years ahead would be lonely. Yet he trusted the shelter of blood over the comfort of kindness. And so upon the doorstep of number 4, he laid the child, tucked in blankets, with a letter resting beside him to explain all that could be explained. The 3 said their soft farewells. Hagrid could barely speak for weeping. McGonagall wondered aloud whether it was truly wise, and Dumbledore only answered gently that the boy would be famous, that every child in their world would know his name, and that it was far better he grow up away from all of that until he was ready to bear it. Then they departed, one by one, back into the night, and the street returned to its ordinary silence. The baby slept on, not knowing that at that very hour, all across the hidden wizarding world, people were raising glasses and whispering his name in wonder, calling him the boy who lived. And so the years began to pass, slow and gray and quiet. The Dursleys took the child in, but they gave him no warmth. They dressed him in the outgrown clothes of their own son, a large and spoiled boy named Dudley, and they made his bedroom a narrow cupboard tucked beneath the stairs, a dark little space full of spiders and dust where a single dim bulb glowed. There he slept, night after night, year after year, listening to the footsteps of the family passing overhead. They told him nothing of who he truly was. They told him his parents had died in a car accident, and that the scar upon his forehead was a leftover from that same crash, and they forbade him ever to ask questions. Strange things sometimes happened around Harry, small, unexplainable things that frightened the Dursleys and puzzled the boy himself. A dreadful haircut grew back overnight, restoring itself while he slept. A jumper his aunt tried to force upon him shrank and shrank until it would not fit over his head at all. Once, fleeing from his cousin and a gang of jeering boys, he found himself, without knowing quite how, sitting safe upon a school rooftop, high above the reach of anyone who wished him harm. Another time, the glass of a great tank at the zoo simply melted away, and a serpent that had seemed almost to understand him slid free and away. Each time, he was punished for what he could not understand and could not control, sent to his cupboard in the dark to think upon his wickedness. And so 10 long years slipped by, unloved and unremarkable to all who watched from the outside, the seasons turning gray and quiet one into the next, until the boy in the cupboard had almost no memory of ever having been anything else at all. He did not know that a place was being held for him, that his name had been written in a great book on the day he was born. He did not know that owls carried word of him across distant skies, or that a school of magic stood, waiting behind mountains and lakes. He knew only the cupboard, the cold, and the long gray mornings of Privet Drive. Yet the 10th summer was ending now, and his 11th birthday was drawing near, and with it, though he could not have guessed it, the whole quiet shape of his small life was about to break open like a door long locked at last, swinging wide. Up next, in Chapter 2, The Keeper of Keys and the Letters from No One, we'll follow the strange flood of letters that begins to arrive for Harry, the frightened flight of the Dursleys to a lonely island, and the great knock upon the door that finally tells him who he truly is. The summer that Harry turned 11 began like every other summer at number 4, Privet Drive, in a haze of dull routine and quiet unkindness. Yet something had shifted in the ordinary air, though no one could have said quite what. It was on a gray morning near the end of July that the first letter came, carried up the garden path with the usual post, and dropped upon the doormat like any other envelope. But this one was different. It was made of thick, yellowish parchment, and it was addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. Harry Potter, and it named the exact room where he slept, the cupboard under the stairs, as though whoever had written it could see straight through the walls of the house. Harry never got to read that first letter. His uncle, Vernon Dursley, snatched it from his hands the moment he saw the strange writing, and his great purple face drained to a sickly white. Whatever the letter meant, it frightened him deeply, and fear in Uncle Vernon always turned quickly to rage. He tore the envelope to pieces and forbade Harry ever to speak of it. But the matter did not end there, for the very next day 2 more letters arrived, addressed in the same green ink to the same boy. And the day after that, there were more still. The letters would not stop. Uncle Vernon nailed the mail slot shut, and the letters came pushed under the door. He blocked the gaps beneath the doors, and they came down the chimney, whirling into the kitchen like a small storm of paper. Every effort he made to keep them out only seemed to summon more, until one bright Sunday morning some 30 or 40 of them came bursting through the boarded fireplace all at once, flying about the room like startled birds, while Harry leapt and grasped, trying to catch even one. His uncle caught him by the collar and flung him back, and not a single letter reached the boy's hands. By now, Uncle Vernon had passed beyond anger into a kind of wild, hunted panic. His eyes had a strange, twitching look, and he muttered to himself in the corners of rooms. At last, unable to bear another morning of that green ink, he made a decision that surprised even his own family. He announced that they were leaving, all of them, that very hour, and he would tell no one where they were going. He bundled them into the car and drove, taking strange turnings and doubling back upon himself, as though he feared the letters might follow the very wheels of the car along the road. They spent one miserable night in a gloomy roadside inn on the edge of a great gray city, where the rain streaked the windows and the beds were hard and cold. Yet, in the morning, 100 letters addressed to Harry lay waiting in neat stacks upon the front desk, and the puzzled woman behind it asked whether the boy's name was truly Harry Potter, for she had never seen so many letters for a single guest. Uncle Vernon snatched them all away and fled again before breakfast, hurrying his family back into the car without so much as a slice of toast. He drove them further and further, out past the towns, out past the fields, until the land gave way to a wild and windswept coast. There, upon a bare and rain-lashed rock far out in the churning sea, stood a small and wretched shack, and this, Uncle Vernon declared with a mad sort of triumph, was where they would be safe. No letter, he was certain, could ever find them there. He rented a little boat from a bewildered fisherman and rowed his family out across the cold gray water to the island. That night was Harry's 11th birthday, though no one in the shack remembered it, or would have cared if they had. The wind howled around the walls, and the sea threw itself against the rock, and Harry lay upon the cold floor, watching the hands of Dudley's watch tick slowly toward midnight. He had made himself a small birthday cake in his mind, a thing of imagination only, and he counted down the final minutes of the day, feeling more alone than he had ever felt. And then, at the very stroke of midnight, when the day of his birth had come round once more, there came a sound that no wind could make. Somebody, out upon that lonely rock in the middle of the raging sea, was knocking upon the door. The knock came again, louder, and then, with a great crash, the door was struck clean off its hinges and fell flat upon the floor. In the doorway, stooping to fit beneath the low frame, stood the largest man Harry had ever seen. He was nearly twice as tall as an ordinary man, and easily 5 times as wide, with a wild tangle of black hair and beard, through which only his glittering eyes and the tip of his nose could be seen. This was Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts, though Harry did not yet know that name. The giant stepped calmly inside, set the door back in its place, and paid no mind at all to Uncle Vernon's sputtering threats. Hagrid had come for Harry, and he had not come empty-handed. From the deep pockets of his enormous coat, he drew out gifts and comforts, and among them a somewhat squashed birthday cake, iced in green and bearing the boy's name, the first birthday cake anyone had ever given him. He greeted Harry warmly, as though he had known him all his life, and indeed he had held him once, long ago, on a night the boy could not remember. And then, seeing the confusion upon the child's face, Hagrid began at last to speak the truth that had been kept from him for 10 long years. He told Harry that he was a wizard, born of a witch and a wizard, and that he had a place waiting for him at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, that the letters had been his invitation all along. He was astonished, and then furious, to learn that the Dursleys had told the boy nothing, that they had let him believe his gifts were mere strangeness, and his scar a leftover of some ordinary accident. When Uncle Vernon dared to insult the memory of Harry's parents and the great Dumbledore himself, Hagrid's patience broke, and there was a small flash of angry magic before he mastered his temper again. Then, more gently, sitting in the flickering light while the storm raged on outside, Hagrid told Harry the story of his mother and father. He told him they had not died in any car crash, but had been murdered by a dark wizard, whose name he could barely bring himself to say, a wizard called Voldemort. He told the boy how that terrible night had unfolded, how his parents had died to protect him, and how the curse meant to kill Harry had rebounded instead and broken the dark wizard's power, leaving only the lightning scar behind. Harry listened in wonder and grief, learning in a single night that he was not the ordinary, unwanted boy he had always believed himself to be, but someone whose very name was known and honored across a hidden world. By the time the pale gray dawn crept over the sea, everything had changed. Harry was no longer merely the boy in the cupboard. He was a wizard, invited to a castle full of magic, the son of 2 brave people who had loved him, and the survivor of a night that the whole wizarding world still spoke of in hushed and grateful tones. Hagrid announced that they would leave that very day, for there was a great deal to buy and only so much time, and that he himself would take Harry to purchase everything a young wizard needed for his first year at school. Up next in Chapter 3, Diagon Alley and the Journey to Hogwarts, we'll wander with Harry through the hidden wizarding street, discover the gold his parents left behind, choose the wand that chooses him in return, and board a scarlet train bound at last for the castle of his dreams. The morning after that stormy night, Hagrid and Harry left the lonely rock behind and made their way at last to the great city of London. To Harry, who had never in his life been anywhere so grand, the crowds and the noise felt like another world entirely, and yet the true wonder was still hidden from view. For there is a place in London that ordinary people pass by without ever seeing. A small and shabby-looking public house called the Leaky Cauldron, tucked between a bookshop and a record shop, invisible to all but those who belong to the wizarding world. Hagrid guided Harry through its low door, and inside, the moment the great man spoke the boy's name, a hush fell over the room and people rose to shake his hand. For even here, Harry was already famous. Beyond the back of the inn lay a small walled courtyard, empty and quiet, with nothing in it but a few weeds and a dustbin. Hagrid tapped a certain pattern upon the bricks with the tip of his pink umbrella, and the wall began to move. The bricks drew apart, folding back upon themselves, until where there had been a solid barrier there, now stood a great archway, opening onto a long, winding, cobbled street. This was Diagon Alley, the hidden heart of wizarding London, and Harry stood before it with his mouth open in astonishment. Shops leaned crookedly over the lane, their windows crowded with cauldrons and broomsticks, with owls and toads and cats, with tottering towers of spellbooks and gleaming instruments whose purposes he could not begin to guess. Their first stop was Gringotts, the Wizarding Bank, a towering white building that leaned a little, as though it were slightly too grand to stand quite straight. It was run by goblins, small and clever creatures with long fingers and sharp faces, and deep beneath the marble floors lay hundreds of vaults, buried far below the streets of London in a maze of dark tunnels. Hagrid led Harry into a small cart that ran upon rails through the cavernous dark, plunging and rattling ever deeper into the earth. When at last they reached Harry's own vault and the door was opened, the boy could scarcely believe his eyes. There, glittering in great heaps, lay mounds of gold coins and silver and bronze, a small fortune that his mother and father had left behind for him. For all the years he had gone without, he had never once been poor. He simply had not been allowed to know. With his pockets full of wizarding money, Harry set about gathering everything upon his long list of school supplies. He was measured for his robes in a shop full of billowing black cloth, and there he met, for the first time, a pale and pointed-faced boy who spoke with cool disdain of those born to non-magical families. A boy Harry did not yet know was called Draco Malfoy. He bought his cauldron and his scales, his heavy stacks of books, and a fine brass telescope. Hagrid, remembering that it was after all still the boy's birthday, gave him a beautiful snowy owl as a gift, a creature with feathers as white as fresh snow and eyes the color of amber, whom Harry would later name Hedwig. Yet of all the shops in Diagon Alley, one mattered more than any other, for no wizard is truly a wizard until he holds his own wand. They came at last to a narrow, dusty little shop with a single wand resting upon a faded cushion in the window, the establishment of an old wand-maker named Ollivander. Inside, the shelves rose up into shadow, packed with thousands upon thousands of long, thin boxes, and the very air seemed to hum with a quiet, waiting magic. Mr. Ollivander was a soft-spoken old man with wide, pale, silvery eyes, and he remembered every wand he had ever sold, including the ones he had sold long ago to Harry's mother and father. The old wand-maker explained that it is not truly the wizard who chooses the wand, but the wand that chooses the wizard. He brought box after box down from the shelves and set Harry to trying them, but each one seemed wrong, and Ollivander would snatch it back the moment it left the boy's grip, murmuring to himself, growing ever more curious and delighted with each failure. At last he brought out a wand of holly, 11 inches long, supple and fine, with a single feather from a phoenix at its core. The moment Harry's fingers closed around it, a warmth ran up his arm, and a stream of red and gold sparks burst from its tip like small fireworks in the dim shop. But Ollivander's face had grown thoughtful, almost troubled. He told Harry something strange and solemn about that particular wand. The phoenix, whose tail feather rested inside it, had given only one other feather in all its life, and that second feather sat within another wand entirely, a wand that had done terrible things. It was, the old man said quietly, the very wand that had given Harry his scar. The two wands were brothers, born of the same phoenix, and Ollivander remarked that we must all expect great things from Harry Potter. For the one who had marked him had also done great and terrible things. Harry left the shop with his wand wrapped carefully under his arm, and a strange, cold feeling settling somewhere in his chest. His time in Diagon Alley came to an end, and Hagrid returned him, for one last stretch of summer, to the dull gray house on Privet Drive, though everything felt different now. Harry passed the final weeks counting the days upon a calendar, until at last the 1st of September arrived, and with it the journey he had dreamed of through every long night. He was given a train ticket that puzzled him greatly, for it named a platform that seemed not to exist. Platform 9 3/4, at a station where the platforms ran only from 9 to 10, with nothing in between. He found the answer at King's Cross Station, standing lost and bewildered with his trunk and his owl, until he overheard a plump, kind-faced woman speaking cheerfully to a whole brood of red-haired children about that very same platform. This was Molly Weasley and her family, and she showed Harry the secret with a warm and knowing smile. One had only to walk straight at the solid barrier between platforms 9 and 10, without fear and without stopping, and pass clean through it, as though the brick were made of mist. Harry did as he was told, shut his eyes, and ran, and when he opened them again, he stood upon a crowded platform beside a gleaming scarlet steam engine, the Hogwarts Express, wreathed in white smoke, waiting to carry him away. Aboard the train, Harry found an empty compartment and was soon joined by the youngest Weasley son, a freckled, cheerful boy named Ron, with a smudge of dirt upon his nose, and a battered old rat named Scabbers. The two became friends before the fields outside had even begun to blur past the windows, sharing sweets bought from the trolley, laughing over chocolate frogs and every flavor beans, talking of families and houses and all the wonders that lay ahead. Later, a girl with bushy brown hair and a rather bossy, breathless manner put her head into their compartment, searching for a lost toad on behalf of another boy. Her name was Hermione Granger, and though she seemed at first a little too clever and a little too eager, she too was bound for the same castle and the same strange new life. And so the great scarlet train rushed on through the deepening evening, carrying its passengers north through darkening hills and silver rivers, further and further from the ordinary world, toward the mountains and the lake and the towers of a school that Harry had waited his whole life to see without ever knowing it existed. Up next, in Chapter 4, The Sorting and the Philosopher's Stone, we'll arrive at Hogwarts at last, watch the ancient hat decide each child's fate, and begin to uncover a secret hidden deep beneath the castle, guarded by a beast with 3 heads. When the Hogwarts Express slowed at last and came to rest beside a small, dark platform, Harry stepped down into the cool night air with his heart full of wonder. A great booming voice called the first years toward it, and there stood Hagrid once more, a lantern glowing in his enormous hand, gathering the youngest students to lead them by a path all their own. He guided them down a steep and narrow track through the darkness, and then the trees fell away, and there before them lay a wide black lake, still as glass, and upon the far shore, high on a mountain, stood the castle. Its many windows glittered with golden light, and its towers rose against the starry sky, and every child fell silent at the sight of it. They crossed the lake in a little fleet of small boats that drifted of their own accord across the smooth, dark water, gliding beneath a curtain of ivy and into a hidden harbor deep beneath the castle. There they were met by the stern witch Harry had not seen since the night upon Privet Drive, Professor McGonagall, who led them up stone steps and into a small chamber to wait. She told them of the 4 great houses of Hogwarts, Gryffindor and Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw and Slytherin, and how each new student would be sorted into one of them, to become like a family for all the years to come. Then the doors swung open, and they were led into the great hall. It was a vast and beautiful room, lit by thousands of floating candles that hung in the air above 4 long tables, and its ceiling was enchanted to look exactly like the sky outside, scattered with stars. At the front, upon a stool, sat an old and battered pointed hat, patched and frayed, and to the astonishment of the first years it opened a rip near its brim and sang them a song about the 4 houses and the qualities each one prized. Then, one by one, the students were called forward to place the hat upon their heads, and the sorting hat, peering into each young mind, called out the house where each belonged. When Harry's turn came and his name was spoken, a whisper ran the length of the hall, for everyone had heard of the boy who lived. He sat upon the stool, and the great hat dropped over his eyes, and he heard a small voice murmuring inside his own head, weighing his courage and his cleverness, considering, at some length, whether he might do well in Slytherin. But Harry thought hard against that house, and the hat, taking his wishes into account, at last cried out the name of Gryffindor. The table beneath the scarlet and gold banners burst into cheers, and Harry went to sit among them, welcomed warmly, and there he found Ron sorted beside him, and Hermione too, and the red-haired Weasley brothers, who clapped him upon the back. At the high table sat the teachers, and at their center, in a great golden chair, sat Albus Dumbledore himself, the headmaster, with his long silver beard and his half-moon spectacles, and his eyes full of a gentle, twinkling kindness. He rose to speak a few odd and cheerful words of welcome, and then the golden plates before them filled with more food than Harry had ever seen. As he ate, he looked along the row of teachers, and his gaze fell upon a sallow man with greasy black hair and a hooked nose, who was watching him with a cold and unmistakable dislike. This was Professor Snape, the master of potions, and at the very moment their eyes met, a sharp pain seared across Harry's scar, sudden and strange, and then was gone. Beside Snape sat a nervous, stammering young man in a great purple turban, Professor Quirrell, who taught the defense against the dark arts, and who seemed altogether too timid to be feared. Harry thought little more of either of them that first night. He was led up moving staircases that shifted beneath his feet, past portraits whose painted figures whispered and waved, through a hidden door behind a painting, and up at last to the round dormitory in Gryffindor Tower, where he slept, for the first time in his life, in a warm 4-poster bed of his very own, high above the sleeping world. The days that followed unfolded into the strange new rhythms of school. Harry learned to find his way through a castle that seemed almost alive, with its 142 staircases, its trick steps that vanished beneath the foot, its doors that would not open unless asked politely, and its walls through which the ghosts drifted like pale smoke. There were suits of armor that sometimes moved of their own accord, and portraits whose painted occupants wandered from frame to frame to gossip with their neighbors, and a caretaker named Filch, who prowled the corridors with his cat, watching for any child out of place. Harry studied the swish and flick of charms, the careful cutting and stirring of potions in the cold stone dungeons, the shapes of the stars in astronomy at midnight upon the highest tower, and the slow, patient art of coaxing a feather to rise gently into the air. He discovered in himself a gift for flying that no lesson had ever taught him, a natural ease upon a broomstick, and for this he was made, though he was only a first year, the youngest player in a century upon the Gryffindor Quidditch team, chasing a small winged ball of gold across the open sky. Yet not everything at Hogwarts was warmth and wonder. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, drawn together by a night of shared danger against a mountain troll, had become the closest of friends, and together they began to notice things that puzzled them. There was a corridor on the 3rd floor that all students were sternly forbidden to enter, and one day, quite by accident, Harry pushed open a certain door and found himself facing something monstrous. In the room beyond crouched an enormous dog, huge and slavering, with 3 great heads and 6 rolling eyes, and it stood, they realized, upon a trapdoor set into the floor. The creature was guarding something hidden in the depths beneath the castle, and though Harry shut the door and hurried away with his heart pounding, the 3 friends could not rest until they knew what a beast so fearsome had been set there to protect. Their curiosity led them, thread by thread, to a secret. They learned that not long before, a small and grubby package had been removed from a high-security vault deep within Gringotts, the very bank Harry had visited, on the very same day he had been there and moved for safekeeping to Hogwarts. Through patient searching and a chance-found card, they came to understand that the object beneath the trapdoor was the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary thing created by an ancient alchemist named Nicholas Flamel. It was a stone that could turn ordinary metal into gold and produce an elixir that granted its drinker eternal life, and it was for this that the 3-headed dog kept its endless watch. As the term wore on toward its close, a dark suspicion began to grow in Harry's mind. He had come to believe that someone within the castle wished to steal the stone, and that this someone might mean to give it to the dark wizard who had murdered his parents, restoring him to power and to life. Harry believed the thief to be Snape, whose coldness and whose watching eyes seemed to follow him everywhere. The 3 friends resolved that if the teachers would not act, then they must, and that they would go down through the trapdoor themselves, past the sleeping guardian, into the deep and secret dark, to protect the stone before it could fall into the wrong hands. Up next in Chapter 5, Whispers Within the Chamber of Secrets, we'll follow Harry through the enchantments that guard the stone, and the truth he finds waiting beneath the castle, and then onward into a second year, where a new and older danger begins to stir behind the ancient walls of Hogwarts. The summer that followed Harry's first year at Hogwarts was a long and lonely one, spent once more beneath the low ceiling of number 4 Privet Drive. The Dursleys had grown no kinder in his absence, and they treated the boy who had survived a dark wizard as though he were something to be locked away and forgotten. Harry counted the slow days, waiting for letters from his friends that never came, unaware that far away a small and desperate creature was keeping those very letters from reaching him. That creature was a house elf named Dobby, a thin and trembling servant bound to a cruel wizarding family. One warm evening, Dobby appeared in Harry's bedroom, wringing his long fingers and bowing until his bat-like ears brushed the floor. He wore only a filthy old pillowcase, and he punished himself for the smallest disloyalty to his masters, beating his own head against the wall and the drawers. For such was the sad and broken life of a bound elf. He had come, he confessed, to warn Harry not to return to Hogwarts, for a terrible danger lay waiting there. It was Dobby, too, who had kept back the summer's letters, hoping that if Harry believed his friends had forgotten him, he might choose to stay safely away. When Harry refused to promise such a thing, the little elf, meaning only to protect him, caused a great pudding to crash upon the Dursleys' guests below. The blame fell upon Harry, and a warning from the Ministry of Magic arrived, and the bars soon went up across his window, like the bars of a cage. Yet rescue came in the deep of night, in the shape of a small blue car that hovered outside the glass. Ron Weasley and his brothers Fred and George had flown their father's enchanted Ford Anglia across the country to free their friend. They wrenched the bars from the wall and carried Harry away over the sleeping hedgerows, up into the wide and starry dark, to the crooked and beloved house called the Burrow. There, Harry passed the happiest weeks he had ever known, folded into the warmth of the Weasley family, where Molly Weasley fed him until he could eat no more, and where Ron's small sister Ginny watched the famous boy with shy and blushing eyes. When the time came to return to school, the family made their way to King's Cross Station and the hidden barrier of platform 9 3/4. But when Harry and Ron ran at the wall together, it had turned solid as stone, sealing them out. Dobby's warning had begun to come true, for the elf had bewitched the gateway shut. Left behind and fearful of missing the train, the two boys made a reckless choice. They climbed once more into the flying car and set off after the scarlet engine through the open sky. The journey ended badly, for the car ran out of enchantment and dropped them into the branches of a savage tree called the Whomping Willow, which beat the little Ford until it staggered away into the forest on its own, and left the boys bruised and in disgrace. So began a strange and shadowed second year. The new teacher of Defense Against the Dark Arts was a vain and golden-haired author named Gilderoy Lockhart, forever smiling for admirers and quick to claim great deeds that were not his own. In the greenhouses, the students repotted screaming mandrakes, their earthy cries muffled by fluffy pink earmuffs, and upon the Quidditch pitch, a sleek new broom carried the pale and sneering Draco Malfoy, who had bought his way onto the Slytherin team and delighted in cruel and poisonous words, calling Hermione Granger a name so hateful that the whole school flinched to hear it named. Then, on the night of the feast that marked the death day of the ghost called Nearly Headless Nick, a coldness crept through the corridors of the castle. Harry alone heard a voice, low and hungry, hissing of blood and of killing, moving somewhere within the walls where no living thing could pass. Following that whisper, he and his friends came upon a dreadful sight. Upon the stone wall, written in letters that shone wet and red as fresh paint, were words declaring that the Chamber of Secrets had been opened, and warning that the enemies of the air should beware. Below the message, stiff and cold and staring, hung the caretaker's cat, Mrs. Norris, frozen as though turned to glass. Fear spread quickly through Hogwarts after that terrible night. The old story was told again in hushed voices, the story of how, 1,000 years before, the 4 founders of the school had at last quarreled, and how Salazar Slytherin had left in bitterness, believing that magic should be taught only to children of wizarding blood. Before he departed, the legend said, Slytherin had built a hidden chamber deep beneath the castle, and sealed within it a monster that only his true heir could ever command. A beast meant one day to purge the school of all those he deemed unworthy. The petrifications did not stop with the cat. One by one, students were found frozen in the halls, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide and unseeing, struck down by something none of them had glimpsed before the darkness took them. A small first year named Colin Creevey was carried to the hospital wing clutching his camera, and after him others followed into that long and dreamless sleep, laid out in rows beneath white sheets while the healers waited for a cure to grow. The teachers walked the students to their lessons in careful groups, and the ghost of a proud, pure-blood knight drifted the corridors, muttering of old glories. And everywhere, the great castle that had once felt so warm, now felt watchful and afraid. The panic thickened, and lessons emptied, and parents wrote in fear to bring their children home. In the midst of it all, suspicion turned toward Harry himself, for at a gathering of the school's dueling club, it was discovered that he could speak to serpents, hissing in the strange tongue called parcel tongue. That gift, so rare and so dreaded, had belonged to Salazar Slytherin above all others. The whispers grew louder and colder in the corridors, and soon the whole castle seemed to murmur the same fearful thought, that Harry Potter must be the heir of Slytherin, the one who had loosed the horror upon them all. Harry knew the whispers were false, yet he could not prove it, and the truth lay buried somewhere he could not reach. Even his own friends among the Gryffindors began to draw a little apart from him, uncertain and afraid, and he walked the halls beneath the weight of their sidelong glances. It was a lonely burden to be feared by the very people he wished to protect, and it taught him early the cruel ease with which a frightened crowd will turn upon one of its own. He and Ron and Hermione resolved to find the truth for themselves. By a clever and difficult brewing of polyjuice potion, which could give a drinker the shape of another for a single hour, they meant to disguise themselves as Slytherin students and coax the secret from Draco Malfoy. The plan worked only in part, for Malfoy, though full of spite, knew nothing of who had truly opened the chamber, only that he wished the culprit well. As winter deepened, Hermione followed a thread of her own, for her sharp mind had begun to circle the shape of the answer. But before she could speak it aloud, she too was found upon the cold stone floor, petrified, her clever eyes fixed and empty. In her stiffened hand, unseen at first, was clutched a single torn page, a small and vital clue that would in time light the way down into the dark. The castle went quiet with dread, the corridors patrolled, the students forbidden to wander, and above it all the message on the wall seemed to wait, patient and terrible, for the monster to strike again. Up next in Chapter 6, The Heir of Slytherin and the Basilisk, we'll follow Harry down at last into the Chamber of Secrets, where a boy from a diary and a great serpent wait in the dark, and where the true face of the heir will be revealed. The clue that Hermione had carried into her long stillness proved, at last, to be the key to everything. The torn page clutched in her frozen hand spoke of a monster of ancient and terrible kind, a serpent so vast and so deadly that a single glance from its yellow eyes could bring instant death, and whose very whisper carried murder through stone. It was a basilisk, the king of serpents, and here at last was the answer to the voice Harry alone had heard moving through the walls, for only one who spoke the serpent tongue could hear a basilisk as it slithered unseen through the hidden pipes of the castle. Beside a single scrawled word in Hermione's writing, the mystery began to unfold, and Harry understood that the creature had never truly been invisible at all, only unheard by all but him. But before the friends could act upon what they had learned, the danger struck at the heart of the Weasley family. Ginny, Ron's small and gentle sister, was taken down into the chamber itself, and a second dreadful message appeared upon the wall, declaring that her bones would lie there forever. The teachers gathered in fear and despair, and Gilderoy Lockhart, who had boasted so loudly of his courage, was sent to face the monster he had never truly fought. Harry and Ron, unwilling to leave Ginny to her fate, went to find him, and discovered the Golden Author packing his bags to flee, a fraud whose famous deeds had all been stolen from braver souls whose memories he had wiped away. Together the two boys forced the trembling Lockhart before them, back to the very place where the danger had begun. They had reasoned out the last of the riddle by then, for Hermione's torn page and her single scrawled word had told them not only the name of the monster, but the manner of its passage, and the moaning ghost of the washroom had died years before, on the very day the chamber was first opened. In that girl's washroom, haunted by the mournful ghost of a girl named Myrtle, who had wept there ever since her long-ago death, they found the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets, hidden behind a tap marked with a tiny carved snake. When Harry hissed to it in the serpent tongue, the sink slid away to reveal a great dark pipe plunging down into the roots of the castle. One after another, they slid into the blackness, down and down through the damp and the dark, until they came at last to a vast stone passage far beneath the school, its floor littered with the small bones of creatures the monster had swallowed. There a cruel misfortune parted them, for Lockhart, in a last cowardly bid to escape, seized Ron's broken wand and turned its magic upon the boys. The spell rebounded upon himself, wiping his own memory clean away and bringing down a wall of rock between the friends. Ron was left behind to guard the fainted fraud and to dig a small passage through the fallen stone, while Harry pressed on alone into the deepest dark, toward a heavy door wrought all over with entwined and silver serpents. At his whispered word it opened, and he stepped into the Chamber of Secrets at the very end of the world beneath the castle. The chamber was long and green and cold, lined with towering pillars carved into coiling snakes, and at its far end rose the great stone face of Salazar Slytherin himself. Upon the wet floor lay Ginny, pale and still and barely breathing, her life slipping slowly away. And beside her stood a tall and handsome boy, dark-haired and calm, watching Harry with cold and curious eyes. He gave his name as Tom Riddle, and though he seemed no more than a memory, he moved and spoke as a living thing. He had come, he said, out of the pages of an old diary that Ginny had found and trusted through the long and lonely months, pouring her secrets into it until the memory within grew strong upon her fears and drained the warmth from her very soul. Riddle told, in his calm and unhurried way, how he had listened to Ginny through the diary all year, how she had confided to him her small sorrows and her secret loves, and how, little by little, he had turned her trust against her, pouring a part of himself into her while she poured her soul into him. It was she, all unknowing, whom he had made his hand, forcing her to daub the messages upon the walls and to loose the serpent from its lair, so that when she woke at last, she remembered nothing of the horrors she had wrought. Slowly, terribly, the rest of the truth was drawn out. Tom Riddle was no ordinary boy at all. The letters of his name, rearranged, spelled out the title the world had come to dread. For he was Lord Voldemort in his youth, and it was he, long ago, who had first opened the chamber and set the basilisk loose upon the school. He was the true heir of Slytherin, and he had spent these months feeding upon Ginny's spirit to grow whole again, meaning to rise once more into the world through the ruin of her innocent life. At Riddle's command, the great stone face split open, and from the darkness within poured the basilisk, an enormous serpent thick as an ancient tree, its scales the color of poison, its deadly eyes ready to kill. Harry ran, keeping his gaze from those eyes, and in his moment of deepest need help arrived from above. Dumbledore's phoenix, the great red bird called Fawkes, swept down into the chamber and tore out the basilisk's eyes with its talons, robbing the beast of its killing stare. And with the phoenix came a shabby old hat, the Sorting Hat, and from within its folds Harry drew a gleaming silver blade set with rubies, the sword of Godric Gryffindor, given to a true and worthy heart in its hour of need. Blinded, but no less deadly, the serpent struck at Harry through the dark, and he drove the sword upward into the roof of its mouth with all his failing strength. The great beast crashed dying to the floor, but a single venomous fang had pierced Harry's arm, and the poison began to spread cold through his veins. Yet the memory of Riddle only smiled, for he still meant to finish Ginny and to feed upon her last breath. Then the phoenix bent its head and wept, and its shining tears fell upon the wound. For the tears of a phoenix can heal even the deadliest hurt, and the poison drained away. Harry took up the long basilisk fang and drove it deep into the pages of the diary. Ink burst from it like dark blood, and the memory of Tom Riddle screamed and twisted and was torn apart into nothing, undone by the fang of his own monster. At once the color returned to Ginny's face, and she woke gasping upon the cold stone, alive and whole and weeping with relief. Together they climbed back up out of the depths, borne by the phoenix through the long dark pipe into the light of the castle above, gathering the dazed Ron and the memoryless Lockhart along the way. Ginny was returned safe to her family, folded once more into her mother's weeping arms, and the petrified students were revived by the ripened mandrakes, waking one by one from their long stone sleep as though no time had passed at all. The wise old headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, welcomed Harry gently and told him that it was his choices, more than his gifts, that showed the truth of who he was, and that the sword had come to him only because he was worthy of it. The school breathed free once more, and there was one last gift to give. Harry, with a clever trick, tucked the ruined diary into a sock and gave it to the cruel wizard Lucius Malfoy, who cast it away in disgust, and so freed the trembling house elf Dobby from his long bondage forever. The little elf's joy knew no bounds, and he vowed himself Harry's friend for all his days. Up next in Chapter 7, The Prisoner of Azkaban, we'll follow Harry into a darker third year, when a man believed to be a murderer escapes the wizard prison, and soul-cold guardians come to haunt the halls of Hogwarts. Another summer passed at number 4, Privet Drive, and it ended, as so many things in Harry's life did, in trouble born of the Dursleys' cruelty. Uncle Vernon's dreadful sister Marge came to stay, and she spoke so vilely of Harry's dead parents that his anger swelled beyond his control and swelled her along with it, until she floated up to the ceiling like a monstrous balloon and drifted out into the night sky. Frightened of the punishment that must surely follow, Harry gathered his things and fled into the darkness, dragging his heavy trunk down an unfamiliar street with no notion of where he might go. There, in the gloom between the street lamps, he sensed something watching him, a great black shape like an enormous dog with gleaming eyes, and his heart turned cold. But before fear could take hold, a triple-decker purple bus called the Night Bus came screeching out of nowhere to carry stranded witches and wizards through the night. It bore Harry to a busy inn called the Leaky Cauldron, where the Minister for Magic himself was waiting. Harry braced for punishment, yet none came. Instead, the minister seemed strangely anxious for his safety, and Harry soon learned why, for grave news had spread through the wizarding world. A prisoner had escaped from Azkaban, the terrible fortress from which no one had ever escaped before. His name was Sirius Black, and he was said to be a servant of Lord Voldemort, a murderer who had slain 13 people with a single curse long ago. Now he had broken free, and the whispered word was that he was coming for Harry Potter. To guard the school against him, the ministry sent the guardians of Azkaban to stand watch at every gate, and these were the dreadful creatures called Dementors, tall and hooded and gliding, who fed upon all happiness and left only despair behind them wherever they passed. On the long train ride back to Hogwarts, the friends met a new teacher dozing in their compartment, a shabby and gentle man named Remus Lupin. When the train shuddered to a halt and the cold crept in, a Dementor came searching through the carriages, and its nearness struck Harry harder than anyone. He heard, from somewhere far away, a woman's screaming voice, and he fell into a faint of terrible cold. It was Lupin who drove the creature back with a burst of silver light and pressed chocolate into Harry's hands to warm him. For chocolate is the small and simple cure for the chill that Dementors leave behind. So began Harry's third year beneath the shadow of both the escaped prisoner and the soul-cold guardians at the walls. The Dementors troubled Harry above all others, and he came to understand why. Because he had suffered so much, because the worst memories in his keeping were the last moments of his mother's life, the creatures dragged those horrors to the surface whenever they drew near, and left him hollow and shaking. Kindly Lupin saw his struggle and offered to teach him a defense, a difficult and ancient piece of magic called the Patronus Charm. To cast it, Harry had to fix his whole mind upon a single happy memory and hold it fast against the cold. And from his wand there would come, if he was strong enough, a guardian of pure silver light to drive the darkness away. The lessons were hard and slow, held in an empty classroom with a boggart standing in for a true Dementor, and again Harry crumpled beneath the remembered screaming before he could speak the words. Each time he faced the creeping cold, he heard the voices of his parents in their last moments, his mother pleading and his father falling. And it took a courage of a rare and quiet kind to reach past that grief for something bright enough to hold against it. Yet little by little the light grew stronger in his wand, a faint mist at first, then a shape, until he could hold the cold at bay. It was a labor of many quiet evenings, and it forged in Harry a courage steadier than any he had known, though the perfect memory still eluded him. Elsewhere the year turned in its familiar rounds. In the class of the short-sighted seer Sybil Trelawney, the students peered into teacups and crystal balls, and the old woman gasped that Harry's cup held the sign of the Grim, the great spectral black dog, whose appearance was said to foretell a person's death. Hermione scoffed at such gloomy fortune-telling, yet the shape of a black dog seemed to follow Harry through the year, glimpsed in shadows and in the stands of the Quidditch pitch. During one storm-lashed match, the Dementors swarmed too near, and Harry fell from his broom high in the air, saved from a killing fall only by the slow charm of the aged headmaster, though his faithful broom was dashed to splinters against the whomping willow below. The grief of that broken broom was softened, come the deep of winter, by a wondrous and mysterious gift. On Christmas morning a long parcel lay upon Harry's bed, and within it gleamed a firebolt, the finest racing broom ever made, swift beyond any other in the world. No card came with it, no name, no word of who had sent so costly a treasure. Hermione, ever cautious, feared it might be cursed, sent by Sirius Black himself to bring Harry harm. And she carried her worry to the teachers, who took the broom away to test it for hidden malice, much to Harry's dismay. As the year deepened, Harry pieced together fragments of a story he had never been told. His father, James, and his friends had been a close and daring band in their own school days, and Sirius Black had been among them, once so trusted that James had named him godfather to his newborn son. It was Sirius, the world believed, who had then betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort. And that betrayal made the news of the escape sting all the sharper. Harry, learning this, burned with a cold new anger, and began to believe that he wished the prisoner dead for what he had done. The village of Hogsmeade itself was a small delight forbidden to Harry that year, for the Dursleys had refused to sign his permission, and so he watched his friends set off toward its sweet shops and its warm inn, while he remained behind the castle walls. It was a small grief among larger ones, yet it stung, for Hogsmeade was the only village in all of Britain where witches and wizards lived alone, its rooftops white with snow, and its windows glowing gold through the winter dusk. There was, besides, an old and secret map of the castle, given to Harry by the Weasley twins, a charmed parchment that showed every hidden passage and every soul who walked the halls, drawn by 4 pranksters who had signed themselves with strange nicknames long ago. By it, Harry could slip unseen from the grounds, and by it, too, he would one day glimpse a name upon the map that could not possibly be there. A name belonging to someone thought long dead, wandering the corridors of the school in the dark. But that riddle lay a little further on, and for now, the map served only to smuggle Harry into the village of Hogsmeade, where he overheard at last the full and dreadful tale of how Sirius Black was said to have led Voldemort to his parents' door. The pieces were drawing together now. The escaped prisoner and the great black dog, the Dementors and the firebolt, the old map and the whispered names of his father's lost friends. All of it was moving, quietly and surely, toward a single night when the truth of everything would come apart and be made new, when nothing Harry believed about the murder of his parents would remain as it seemed. Up next in Chapter 8, A Godfather Found, A Rat Undone, we'll uncover the true story of Sirius Black at last, the traitor hidden in plain sight, and a single desperate night that turns back upon itself. The truth, when it came all at once, on a night that began in sorrow and turned toward wonder. It started far from any danger, with a fat old rat named Scabbers, Ron's ancient and ailing pet, who had grown thin and frightened through the long year as though something were hunting him. On that fateful evening, the great black dog that had haunted Harry all year appeared once more upon the grounds, and it seized Ron by the leg and dragged him, along with the struggling rat, down a hidden tunnel beneath the Whomping Willow, into the ruined and boarded house at its far end that the villagers called the Shrieking Shack. Harry and Hermione followed into the dark, and there they found not a dog at all, but a gaunt and ragged man, Sirius Black himself, the escaped prisoner, thin from long years in Azkaban and burning with a strange and desperate purpose. Harry rushed at him in fury, believing he faced the man who had betrayed his parents. But before violence could take hold, Remus Lupin burst into the room, and instead of seizing his old schoolfellow, he embraced him as a friend. Slowly, patiently, the two men laid the whole tangled truth bare before the astonished children. Long ago, they explained, when James and Lily Potter went into hiding to escape Lord Voldemort, they had entrusted the secret of their hiding place to a keeper, believing that keeper to be Sirius Black. But at the last, fearing that everyone would suspect him, Sirius had urged them to choose another instead, a quieter and less likely friend named Peter Pettigrew. It was Pettigrew, small and timid and overlooked, who had held the secret, and it was Pettigrew who had betrayed it to Voldemort and sent him to Godric's Hollow to murder James and Lily. Then, when Sirius came hunting him in grief and rage, it was Pettigrew who had cut down a street full of bystanders with a single blast, cut off his own finger, and vanished, leaving Sirius to be blamed for murders he had never committed and for a betrayal that was truly Pettigrew's own. For all those years, Sirius had sat in the cold cells of Azkaban, kept from despair only by the one thought the Dementors could not steal from him, the knowledge that he was innocent, held fast in his mind while the Guardians drained away all his happier memories. It was that single, unyielding truth that had at last given him the strength to slip out through the bars in the shape of a great black dog, thin enough to escape where no man could, driven by a purpose that would not let him rest. And Pettigrew had not died that day. He had transformed himself into a rat and hidden away, as he had learned to do in his school days, and he had lived on for 12 long years as a family's harmless pet. He was Scabbers, the very rat that trembled now in Ron's hands, the traitor who had hidden in plain sight all along, so near to Harry that he had slept in the same house and eaten at the same table. When Voldemort's whispered return began to stir the world once more, the frightened rat had known his old master might soon call, and had grown thin with dread that the truth would find him out at last. With Lupin and Sirius standing over him, the rat was forced back into the shape of a man, small and gray and cringing, his nose sharp and his eyes darting for escape. Pettigrew wept and pleaded and groveled upon the floor, twisting his words this way and that, but the truth was written plain in his cowering shame. Sirius and Lupin meant to end him then and there. Yet Harry, in a moment that would echo through all the years to come, stepped between them and stayed their hands. He would not have his father's two friends become killers for the sake of the rat. Instead, they bound Pettigrew and resolved to drag him back to the castle alive, so that the whole world might see the man whose living breath proved Sirius Black an innocent one. In that same hour, another secret came to light, for Remus Lupin was himself a creature of the night. He was a werewolf, bitten in his boyhood, and it was for his sake that James and Sirius and Pettigrew had long ago learned to become animals, so that they might keep their afflicted friend company through his monthly torment. They had called themselves the Marauders, and they were the four who had drawn the old and secret map of the castle. Yet this night was a night of the full moon, and Lupin, in the joy and haste of the truth, had forgotten to take the potion that kept his transformation gentle. As they climbed out into the moonlit grounds, the change came upon him. His body twisted and stretched into the shape of a great and mindless wolf, and in the chaos that followed, Pettigrew seized his chance. He slipped free of his bonds, shrank once more into a rat, and scurried away into the long grass and was gone. The traitor undone, and then, in a cruel turn, undone no longer, escaping into the dark to seek his old master. And so the proof of Sirius Black's innocence vanished with him, and Sirius was left a hunted man still, condemned in the eyes of a world that would never now believe him. Worse followed, for the Dementors, sensing despair, swept down upon Sirius and Harry by the Black Lake. A great tide of soul-cold guardians come to feed. Sirius crumpled beneath them, and Harry felt the killing cold closing over his own mind. Yet across the water there appeared a single stag of blinding silver light, a great Patronus that drove the whole swarm back and away. Harry believed, in that swimming moment, that his dead father had come to save him, and then he knew no more. But the night was not yet finished with its wonders. Hermione had carried all year a small and secret device called a time turner, granted her so that she might attend more lessons than the hours allowed, and now the wise old headmaster set her a graver task. Turning its little hourglass, she and Harry slipped back through 3 hours of that same evening, hidden and unseen, moving carefully so as not to be glimpsed by their earlier selves. They freed the noble Hippogriff Buckbeak, who had been sentenced to death for a small offense, and led him quietly away before the axe could fall. And when the Dementors gathered again by the lake, Harry understood at last whose silver stag had saved him. It had been no ghost of his father, but himself come back through time, and knowing now that he could do it, he raised his wand and summoned the great shining Patronus with a full and steady heart. Before he went, Sirius spoke gently to his godson of the future and offered him a home, for as Harry's godfather he had the right to take the boy in and raise him away from the Dursleys at last. It was a fragile promise, made by a hunted man who could not yet come out of hiding, yet the very offer of it warmed Harry more than any gift he had ever received, the first time in his life that anyone had wished to make a home for him. Upon the freed Hippogriff, Sirius flew away into the night to freedom, a fugitive still, but alive and unbroken, and Harry had gained. In the space of a single turning night, the one thing he had always longed for and never known. He had found a godfather, a living piece of his lost father's world, someone bound to him by love and by promise. It was a fragile happiness and a hunted one, but it was real, and Harry carried it back into the ordinary days of school like a small warm light against the dark that he sensed was gathering once more beyond the walls of Hogwarts. Up next in Chapter 9, The Goblet of Fire and the Triwizard Tournament, we'll follow Harry into a fourth year of wonder and danger, when three great schools gather and a cup of fire chooses a champion who was never meant to compete. The summer before Harry's fourth year began with a strange and glittering excitement. The Weasleys came for him, and together they made their way to the Quidditch World Cup, that grand gathering of witches and wizards from every corner of the earth. They traveled by Portkey in the pale hours before dawn, a battered old boot that tugged them all through the air by the navel and set them down upon a misted hillside. All around them, tents rose in their thousands, disguised as best they could be to seem like the ordinary camps of ordinary people. Though chimneys sprouted where no chimney should be, and cats prowled that looked far too knowing. That night, high in the top box, Harry watched Ireland and Bulgaria play beneath a sky lit by 100,000 cheers. The stadium had been raised in secret upon that lonely moor, vast beyond imagining, its stands rising higher than the tallest tower Harry had ever seen. He saw Victor Krum, the youngest seeker in the world, dive and turn like a hawk of living muscle, and he saw the Irish carry the day upon a storm of green sparks and roaring song. The mascots danced upon the field, the graceful Vila and the little bearded men who showered gold that faded before morning, and for a few glittering hours the whole gathered world seemed nothing but joy. It was a night of pure delight, the kind that seems to belong to a gentler world. Yet delight, in Harry's life, had a habit of turning to shadow before the morning came. For in the deep of that same night, screams tore through the campsite. A mob of masked figures moved among the tents, cloaked and hooded in black, lifting a family of terrified muggles high into the air and twisting them like puppets. These were Death Eaters, the old servants of Lord Voldemort, grown bold for the first time in 13 years. The wizards scattered in panic, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione fled into the darkness of the wood. There, above the treetops, someone cast a sign none of them had ever seen before. A vast and glowing skull with a serpent for a tongue. It was the Dark Mark, the emblem of the Dark Lord himself, and the sight of it turned every grown wizard pale with an old and buried terror. The peace of that summer was broken, and something long asleep had stirred. Yet when September came, Hogwarts opened its doors as it always had, and the castle offered its warmth against the gathering cold. At the welcome feast, Dumbledore rose to make an announcement that set the whole hall murmuring. That year, there would be no Quidditch. Instead, Hogwarts would host the Triwizard Tournament, an ancient contest of magic that had not been held for over a century, a friendly rivalry among three great schools of the wizarding world. Soon the guests arrived. From the north came the students of Durmstrang upon a great ship that surfaced from the Black Lake, and among them walked Victor Krum himself. From the south came the students of Beauxbaton in a powder blue carriage drawn by winged horses, led by the towering and gracious headmistress, Madame Maxime. The Goblet of Fire was brought forth, a rough-hewn cup filled with dancing blue flame, and into it the hopeful champions dropped their names. Only those of age might enter, for Dumbledore drew a glowing circle around the goblet that no younger student could cross. On the night of the choosing, the flames turned red and spat forth 3 slips of parchment. From Durmstrang, Victor Krum. From Beauxbatons, the silver-haired Fleur Delacour. From Hogwarts, the kind and steady Cedric Diggory. The hall roared its approval, and the matter seemed settled. But then the goblet flared once more, unwilling and strange, and a fourth name drifted down through the air. The name upon it was Harry Potter. A hush fell, and then a storm of confusion. Harry had not entered. He had not wished to enter. He was 3 years too young and had crossed no line. Yet the goblet was a binding magical contract, and once a name came forth, the chosen one was bound to compete. Dumbledore's face was grave, for he understood that some hidden hand had placed that name in the flames, and that whoever had done it meant Harry harm. The weeks that followed were among the loneliest Harry had ever known. The school believed he had cheated his way into glory, and even Ron, his truest friend, drew away in jealousy and hurt, thinking Harry had found a way in without him. Badges were made that flashed cruel words against him, and the corridors that had once felt like home now seemed full of turned backs and cold glances. Hermione alone stayed close, patient and steady through it all, and Harry bore the whispers and the pointed stares in silence, keeping his hurt to himself as he had learned to do so many years before in the cupboard under the stairs. The first task came in November, and it was a terror to behold. Each champion was to face a dragon and steal from beneath it a golden egg. Harry drew the Hungarian horntail, the fiercest of the four, a beast of black scales and a tail of spikes. Yet he had been quietly helped and quietly warned, and he did not fight the dragon with strength he did not have. Instead, he called upon his broom, summoned from far away, and flew. He rose and dived through the smoke, dancing upon the air as he had learned to do, until at last he snatched the golden egg from the nest. The crowd that had scorned him now cheered, and Ron, watching, understood at last that no boy would choose such danger for glory. The two friends were reconciled, and the shadow between them lifted. The golden egg held a clue, though it screamed like a banshee when opened in the air. It was Cedric who kindly repaid Harry's earlier honesty, hinting that the egg should be opened beneath the water. There, in the warm dark of the prefect's bath, Harry heard a chorus of eerie voices singing of the second task, of something precious that would be taken from him and hidden in the depths of the Black Lake. In the cold of February, the champions plunged into that lake to recover what had been taken. Harry, breathing through the strange gift of gillyweed, swam down into a green and murky world of merpeople and grindylows and drifting weeds. He found 4 captives bound beneath the water, and among them Ron, held there as the thing Harry would most sorely miss. Harry could have taken Ron and risen, but his heart would not let him leave the others, and so he waited, guarding them all until every champion had come. For that stubborn nobility the judges honored him, and he rose to the surface second, yet first in the eyes of many. So the year turned, and 2 tasks were done. Between them the castle went on with its ordinary magic, its lessons and its feasts, its snowfalls and its firesides. Yet all the while, a disguised enemy walked among the students and teachers, a false friend wearing a trusted face, guiding Harry through each trial, not to save him, but to deliver him to a darker purpose. No one saw the hand behind the veil, and no one guessed that every step of this tournament had been laid like a path toward a single terrible night. The third and final task drew near. In the Quidditch grounds, a great hedge maze had grown, tall and twisting and full of things that watched from within. Somewhere at its heart the Tree Wizard Cup waited, a prize that promised eternal glory to the champion who reached it first. Harry did not yet know that the maze was a snare, nor that the glory at its center would taste of blood and grief. Up next in Chapter 10, The Graveyard and the Return of the Dark Lord, will follow Harry and Cedric into the heart of the maze to the cup that carries them far from Hogwarts, and to the dark and lonely place where an old evil at last takes shape again. The night of the third task came at last, warm and still, with a great crowd gathered around the darkened maze. The 4 champions stood at its edge, and one by one they were sent into the towering hedges, Harry and Cedric first, for they shared the lead. The walls closed behind them, and the roar of the crowd fell away, until there was only the whisper of leaves and the thud of their own hearts in the green and living dark. The maze was a place of quiet dread. Paths shifted and folded, closing behind the champions and opening in strange new directions, so that no one could keep a straight course for long. Mist curled low along the ground, and creatures moved unseen beyond the hedges, and a golden fog drifted through one turning that seemed to overturn the very sky. Harry and Cedric parted and wandered alone, meeting again only when danger pressed. When Fleur was struck down and Krum, enchanted against his own will, turned upon Cedric, it was Harry who cried out a warning and drove the curse away. Twice the 2 Hogwarts champions saved each other, and a strange fellowship grew between them. 2 boys lost in the same maze, each unwilling to win by another's ruin. The nearer they came to the heart of it, the more the hedges seemed to lean inward, as though the maze itself were holding its breath. At last they came together upon the Tree Wizard Cup, glowing silver at the maze's heart. Each urged the other to take it, for each felt the other had earned it more. In the end they agreed to reach for it together, to seize the glory as one and let Hogwarts share the honor between them. So they grasped the handles side by side, and in that instant the world was pulled from beneath their feet. For the cup was no prize at all. It was a portkey, enchanted by the hidden enemy, and it did not carry them to victory, but far away, across the dark countryside, to a place neither of them knew. They landed hard in a cold and overgrown graveyard, among crooked headstones and the black shape of an old ruined house upon the hill. The night was silent and wrong. Harry's scar burned as it had not burned in years, a searing pain that told him some old evil was very near. Out of the darkness came a small hooded figure, carrying a bundle in its arms, as one might carry a child, though what it held was no child at all. A high, cold voice gave an order, cruel and without mercy, and the figure raised its wand. In a flash of green light, Cedric Diggory fell, struck down without a chance, without a reason, a kind and gentle boy dead upon the wet grass. Harry could only watch, and the grief of it would never quite leave him. The hooded servant was Peter Pettigrew, the traitor who had once betrayed Harry's parents, and now he bound Harry to a tall marble headstone, tying him fast so that he could not move nor flee. Then he set about a dark and terrible work. A great stone cauldron stood ready, filled with water, and lit beneath by fire until it seethed. Into it Pettigrew lowered the small and shriveled thing he carried, the last broken remnant of Lord Voldemort, less than a body, less than a ghost, kept barely alive through 13 long years of exile. The ritual that followed was one of the darkest magics, 3 ingredients given freely or taken by force. First, bone of the father, unknowingly given, drawn from the grave of Voldemort's own Muggle father, who lay in that very churchyard. Then, flesh of the servant, willingly sacrificed, as Pettigrew with a whimper cut away his own right hand and let it fall into the brew. And last, blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, as the traitor drew a blade across Harry's arm and let his blood drip into the seething cauldron. It was Harry's blood the Dark Lord chose above all others, for reasons that would not be understood for years to come. The cauldron blazed white, and from its depths rose a shape. Pettigrew, weeping, wrapped it in dark robes, and out of the vapor stepped a tall and terrible man, thin and pale as bone, with a face flat as a serpent's and slitted eyes that gleamed red in the dark. Lord Voldemort had returned to a body of his own, whole again after all his long years of ruin. He flexed his long white fingers as though tasting the world anew, and his mouthless smile was the coldest thing in all that cold place. He rewarded his servant with a new hand fashioned of silver, and then he summoned the others. He pressed the dark mark burned upon Pettigrew's arm, and across the country the old Death Eaters felt the call and came. They appeared among the graves in their masks and hoods, one after another, with soft cracks in the night air, kneeling in a wide circle around their master and kissing the hem of his black robes. Voldemort walked among them, cold and mocking, reminding them of their years of silence, of how few had searched for him, of how many had claimed innocence when he had fallen, of how he alone had found the path back from the edge of death. He named their absent fellows, the faithless and the imprisoned and the dead, and the circle trembled to hear him. Then he turned to Harry. He wished the boy to die not in secret, but before witnesses, to prove that the child who had once undone him was nothing, was ordinary, was beaten. He untied Harry from the headstone and bade him fight, and the two faced each other with wands drawn, the oldest and the youngest enemy in all that dark gathering. Voldemort cast the killing curse, and Harry, with no plan but instinct, cast a shielding charm, and their two wands met in a stream of golden light. For the wands were brothers, each carrying a feather from the same phoenix, and they would not work against one another. Their spells locked together in a shining thread, and a great dome of golden light rose over the two of them, sealing them apart from the watching Death Eaters. From Voldemort's wand, forced backward by a magic he did not command, came echoes of the last lives it had taken. Cedric came first, a pale and gentle shade, and then an old man, and then the shape of Harry's own mother, and last his father, whispering words of courage. They gave Harry the moment he needed. They told him to hold on, and then to break away and run. Harry tore his wand free, and the golden thread snapped. He ran to Cedric's fallen body, for the boy had asked with his dying echo that Harry carry him home, and he would not leave him in that dreadful place. Curses flew past him. He reached the body, and he reached the cup where it lay in the grass, and he flung out his hand and caught it. The portkey seized him once more and dragged him up and away, back across the miles, back to the light and noise of Hogwarts, with Cedric held tight in his arms. He landed upon the grass at the maze's edge, before the whole waiting school, clutching a dead boy and weeping. The band still played, the crowd still cheered for a champion returned, until slowly the joy turned to horror as they understood what Harry held and what his tears meant. Cedric's father came through the crowd and knelt over his son with a cry that silenced the whole stadium. The Dark Lord had risen again, and Harry alone had seen it. Yet, in the days that followed, the wizarding world would not believe him. The Ministry of Magic, unwilling to face so terrible a truth, would call him a liar and a fool, and the shadow of denial would fall across everything. Up next in Chapter 11, The Order of the Phoenix, we'll see how a frightened ministry turns its back on the truth, how an old secret society gathers once more against the dark, and how Harry learns that the fight ahead must be fought in whispers and in shadow. The summer after Cedric's death was a bitter and lonely one for Harry. He was shut away once more at number 4, Privet Drive, cut off from his friends, hungry for any word of the wizarding world. No news came, and the silence gnawed at him. Then, one hot evening, 2 Dementors came gliding down a Muggle alley, and Harry was forced to cast the Patronus charm to save himself and his cousin. For that single act of self-defense, the ministry moved swiftly to expel him from Hogwarts. So eager were they to be rid of the boy who spoke of Voldemort's return. He was rescued at last, whisked away by a guard of witches and wizards who came for him in the dark upon their broomsticks, and they flew him low across the sleeping country to a hidden house in London, number 12, Grimmauld Place, the ancient and gloomy ancestral home of the Black family, a house that appeared between its neighbors only to those who knew its secret. There he found the truth of what had been kept from him. An old secret society had gathered once more, the Order of the Phoenix, founded long ago by Dumbledore to stand against the Dark Lord. Sirius, his godfather, harbored them in his gloomy inherited house, and among them were faces Harry knew and loved, working in shadow because the ministry would not act. For the Ministry of Magic, led by the fearful Cornelius Fudge, had chosen denial over truth. To admit that Voldemort had returned was to admit their own helplessness, and so they declared instead that Harry and Dumbledore were liars, sowers of panic, hungry for attention and power. The great wizarding newspaper printed cruel words about them week after week, until much of the world believed that the boy who had survived was merely a troubled and dishonest child. At his hearing before the whole assembled court, Harry was nearly expelled in truth, saved only by Dumbledore's quiet defense. He returned to Hogwarts under a cloud of suspicion, and he found the castle changed. The ministry, unable to control what the school taught, had installed one of its own to watch over it. Her name was Dolores Umbridge, a small and smiling woman who dressed all in pink and spoke in a soft, high voice, and who was, beneath that sweetness, as cruel as anyone Harry had ever known. Umbridge took the post of defense against the dark arts, and under her, the subject became a thing of paper and theory alone. She would not let the students lift their wands, for the ministry did not wish them prepared to fight an enemy the ministry insisted did not exist. When Harry spoke aloud the truth of Voldemort's return, she punished him with a quill that carved his own words into the back of his hand, over and over, until the words scarred there for life. He bore it in silence, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of his pain. Piece by piece, Umbridge tightened her grip. The ministry passed decree after decree, and with each one she gained more power, until she named herself High Inquisitor and then Headmistress in all but name, ruling the castle through fear, banning gatherings, inspecting teachers, dismissing those she disliked. Hogwarts, once a place of warmth and freedom, grew cold and watchful under her pink and pitiless reign. There was another cruelty in Umbridge's rule that cut deeper than her decrees. She had taken the one lesson the students most needed to learn, the defense of their own lives, and turned it to dust and empty words at the very hour when a true darkness was rising in the world. She wished them ignorant and obedient, and she would have kept them so. Yet the students would not be left defenseless. At Hermione's urging, Harry agreed to teach them himself. In secret, the practical magic Umbridge denied them. They met in a hidden room within the castle, the Room of Requirement, which appeared only to those in true need and gave them exactly what they required. There, in secret, Harry trained his fellow students to duel, to shield, to summon the Patronus that drives back despair. They called themselves Dumbledore's Army, a small defiance and a great one, a name that laughed at the ministry's fear. Under Harry's teaching, they grew skilled and brave, and for the first time since Cedric's death, Harry felt himself of use, not a liar nor a fool, but a leader. That year, Harry found a strange comfort and a stranger dread in his own bond with the Dark Lord. His scar, the mark of the curse that had failed to kill him, had become a window. In his sleep, and sometimes waking, He glimpsed Voldemort's thoughts and moods, felt his joy and his fury as if they were his own. Once he saw through the eyes of the great serpent Nagini as she struck at Ron's father in a dim ministry corridor, and his warning saved the man's life. But the bond was a door that opened both ways, and Dumbledore, fearing what the Dark Lord might do through it, grew distant and would not meet Harry's eye, and set Snape to teach him to close his mind. Harry did not understand, and the coldness wounded him. The lessons with Snape were a misery, for the two had never loved each other, and the opening of Harry's mind to that cold and unfriendly man felt like a violation rather than a shield. Harry learned little, and in truth, the door in his mind swung wider rather than closing, so that the dreams pressed in upon him all the more. Again and again in his dreams, Harry walked down a long, dark corridor, drawn toward a plain black door he could never quite reach. The dream tugged at him night after night, growing stronger, and he did not know what lay behind that door. Only that some part of Voldemort longed for it with a hunger that seeped into Harry's own heart. Slowly it came clear that the door belonged to the Department of Mysteries, deep beneath the Ministry of Magic, where the most secret magics of the world were kept and studied. And there, Harry would learn. Lay a prophecy. Long ago, words had been spoken about Harry and Voldemort, words that bound their two fates together, and the record of them rested upon a shelf in that deep and hidden hall. Voldemort wanted it above all things, wanted to hear the whole of what had been foretold, for he had heard only a fragment years before, and that fragment had led him to Godric's Hollow and to his own undoing. Now he schemed to draw Harry to the door and use him to seize the prophecy, for only those of whom it spoke could lift it from its shelf. The pressure of the year mounted toward a breaking point. Umbridge grew ever more tyrannical, and at last her rule cracked apart when Dumbledore's army was discovered. Dumbledore took the blame upon himself to shield his students, and vanished from the school before the ministry could seize him, leaving Hogwarts wholly in Umbridge's grasping hands. Harry felt more alone than ever, cut off from the headmaster he trusted, tormented by dreams he could not close out, haunted by the corridor and the door and the whisper of a prophecy he had never heard. Then came a vision more terrible than the rest. Harry saw, or believed he saw, Sirius held prisoner in that very hall of the Department of Mysteries, tortured upon its cold stone floor. His godfather was the last of his family, the one man who had offered him a home, and Harry could not bear to leave him to such pain. He did not know that the vision was a trap, planted in his mind by a Dark Lord who had at last learned to use their bond as a weapon. He knew only that Sirius was in danger, and that he must go to him. Up next in Chapter 12, The Battle in the Hall of Prophecy, we'll follow Harry and his friends as they race to the heart of the Ministry, where a snare has been laid, where Death Eaters wait among the shelves, and where a grief awaits Harry that he will carry all his days. Harry could not shake the vision of Sirius in pain, and he was certain there was no time to lose. He tried first to be sure, and through the fire he glimpsed only that Sirius was not at home, which seemed to him proof enough of the worst. And so, with the way to Dumbledore closed and the castle in Umbridge's hands, Harry resolved to go himself to the Department of Mysteries to save his godfather. He did not go alone. Ron and Hermione would not let him, and neither would the others of Dumbledore's army who had grown close and brave that year. Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood and Neville Longbottom stood with him. 6 young friends against a danger none of them truly understood. They flew through the darkening sky upon the backs of Thestrals, the strange skeletal horses that only those who had seen death could see, and the night wind carried them all the long way to London. They slipped into the Ministry through a quiet and darkened entrance, down into the very heart of the building where few were ever permitted to go. Deep beneath the city they found the Department of Mysteries, a place of cold circular rooms and turning doors and shelves that stretched away into shadow. One black door led into a round chamber whose many doors all looked alike, and which spun when they entered so that they lost all sense of where they had come from. They passed through rooms of strange wonders, a great tank of pale, drifting brains, a shining bell jar in which time itself ran backward and forward, before they found the way they sought. They came at last to the Hall of Prophecy, a vast cavern filled with row upon row of small glass orbs, each one glowing faintly, each one holding a prophecy spoken long ago. There was no sign of Sirius anywhere. There was no torture, no captor. Nothing but silence and dust and the pale light of 1,000 spheres. Upon one shelf, Harry found an orb that bore his own name and Voldemort's beside it. As he lifted it, cold voices spoke out of the dark all around them. Death Eaters stepped from between the shelves, masked and cloaked, led by the cruel and laughing Lucius Malfoy. There had been no vision of truth, only a lie planted in Harry's mind. Sirius had never been in danger. The whole of it had been a snare to draw Harry here, to make him carry that fragile orb into Voldemort's reach, for only one of whom the prophecy spoke could take it from the shelf, and the Dark Lord could not come himself unseen. The Death Eaters demanded the prophecy, and Harry stalled and stalled, whispering to his friends to be ready to run. Then the young friends scattered, hurling curses and toppling the great shelves, and the glass orbs shattered in their thousands, filling the air with the ghostly murmurs of forgotten prophecies. Through smoke and falling glass the 6 children fought grown and hardened dark wizards, and though they were outmatched, they did not fall. They ran through the strange turning rooms of the department, and one by one they were hurt and scattered, until it seemed the trap must close upon them all. Then, at the darkest moment, help came. The Order of the Phoenix arrived, summoned by a warning Harry had managed to leave behind. Sirius himself came, and Remus Lupin, and the fierce old Mad-Eye Moody, and Nymphadora Tonks, and Kingsley Shacklebolt, and the battle turned. The Order drove back the Death Eaters through the great stone chamber, where an ancient archway stood upon a dais, hung with a tattered and whispering veil. Sirius fought at Harry's side, joyful in battle, protecting his godson as he had always longed to do. He fought his own cousin, the mad and merciless Bellatrix Lestrange, taunting her, laughing even. And then a jet of light struck him full in the chest. Sirius fell backward, slow and graceful, a look of faint surprise upon his face, and he fell through the whispering veil upon the archway and did not come out again. He was gone, passed beyond the veil into whatever lies past death, and the last of Harry's family was taken from him in a single breath. Harry could not understand it. He screamed and struggled to reach the veil, certain that Sirius must be only just behind it, that he might yet step back through. Lupin held him fast, gently, and told him it was too late, that Sirius was gone, that no one returned through that archway. The grief of it was a wound deeper than any curse, and it broke something open in Harry's heart. In his rage and anguish, he chased Bellatrix through the ministry and tried to strike her with the cruelest of curses, and found that he could not, for such magic was not truly in him. And then Voldemort himself appeared, come at last from the shadows, to seize the boy and the prophecy both, only to find the prophecy already shattered and Harry beyond his reach. In that instant Dumbledore arrived, and the 2 great wizards fought as few had ever fought, fire and water and stone and living statues answering their wands, the whole atrium of the ministry trembling around them. Voldemort could not overcome Dumbledore, and so he tried a subtler cruelty, pouring himself into Harry's mind through their shared bond, filling him with such pain and darkness that Harry longed to die. Yet it was love and grief that saved him, for the sorrow in Harry's heart was more than the Dark Lord could bear to touch, and Voldemort was driven out. He fled, but not before the whole truth was seen. For into the atrium came the Minister of Magic himself, Cornelius Fudge, and a crowd of ministry officials, and they saw with their own eyes the tall, pale shape of Lord Voldemort before he vanished into the air. There could be no more denial, no more talk of lies. The Dark Lord had returned, and now the whole world knew it, a full year after Harry had first told them so. It was a bitter vindication, bought with Cedric's death and Sirius's, and it gave Harry no comfort at all. Afterward, in the quiet of his office, Dumbledore at last told Harry what he had withheld for so long. He explained the prophecy, the words that had been spoken before Harry was born, that neither Harry nor Voldemort could live while the other survived, that one must in the end destroy the other. He explained why he had kept his distance that year, fearing the bond between them, and he wept for the burden he had laid upon so young a boy. Harry learned that his fate and Voldemort's were bound together, as by a single thread, that the war to come was, in some measure, his alone to end. In his anguish, Harry raged even against Dumbledore, breaking the fragile things upon the old wizard's shelves, and Dumbledore let him, bearing the boy's grief without complaint, for he knew that he himself had helped to earn it. It was a strange and heavy thing to be so young and to carry the weight of a whole war upon one's shoulders, and Dumbledore's sorrow for Harry was as deep as any he had known. He grieved through the long summer that followed, hollowed by the loss of the godfather he had known for so brief a time. Yet even grief must one day soften, and even the darkest year must give way to another. The world had woken to the danger at last. The order stood ready, and Harry, though weary and sorrowful, was no longer alone in the knowing. There were truths still hidden, old secrets in Voldemort's past that only Dumbledore had begun to guess, and the finding of them would be the work of the years to come. Up next in Chapter 13, The Half-Blood Prince, we'll follow Harry into a 6th year at Hogwarts, to a mysterious old potions book and its secret former owner, and to the memories through which Dumbledore will reveal the darkest secret of Lord Voldemort's long flight from death. The summer after Sirius fell through the veil passed slowly for Harry, and he carried his grief the way one carries a stone in the pocket, always there, worn smooth by handling. When at last the new term drew near, it was Dumbledore himself who came to fetch him from Privet Drive, appearing on the doorstep in a traveling cloak, and treating the astonished Dursleys with a courtesy they had never learned to return. Together the old headmaster and the boy stepped away into the night, and Harry felt, for the first time in a long while, that he was being told the truth by someone who loved him. Before Hogwarts opened its gates, Dumbledore had an errand. He and Harry walked into a quiet village and found a small, cluttered house that seemed at first to have been ransacked by burglars, its furniture upended, its walls stained. It was, in truth, a disguise. The house belonged to Horace Slughorn, a retired professor of considerable talent and even greater caution, who had spent the year of Voldemort's return moving from place to place, hiding among the belongings of Muggles, terrified of being found. Dumbledore coaxed him gently, and Harry, without quite meaning to, provided the final persuasion. Slughorn had known Harry's mother, Lily, and had loved her cleverness, and something in the son stirred the old collector's fondness. By morning, he had agreed to return to Hogwarts and teach potions once more. That decision rearranged the whole shape of the year. Severus Snape, who had wanted the post of potions master for so long, was given instead the subject he had coveted even more deeply: defense against the dark arts. And so Harry, who had never managed to succeed at potions under Snape's cold eye, found himself back in the dungeon classroom under Slughorn, who welcomed high marks and expected them. Because Harry had not planned to continue the subject, he had brought no book of his own, and Slughorn lent him a battered second-hand copy from the store cupboard. That old book changed everything. Its pages were crammed with corrections and scribbled notes in a small, cramped hand. Better instructions than the printed ones, cleverer methods, shortcuts that turned clumsy brews into perfect ones. Following the notes, Harry brewed a potion so flawless that he won a small vial of liquid luck, a golden draught called Felix Felicis, as a prize. Slughorn was delighted, believing he had discovered a natural gift, and he began to draw Harry into his circle of favorites, a little gathering of clever and well-connected students whom the old professor liked to collect the way other men collected fine wines. Hermione, who studied harder than anyone and could not understand how Harry suddenly outshone her, grew quietly wounded, for she had always been the finest student in every class, and it stung her to be surpassed by a borrowed book. On the inside cover of the volume, written in the same neat hand, was a name that its owner had given himself. He was the half-blood prince, and Harry did not know who he was, only that the prince's whispered wisdom made him feel, for once, quietly gifted. As the months passed, Harry came to lean upon that little book like a friend, though he knew nothing at all of the hand that had filled it. The year turned, and with it turned the tides of friendship and feeling that ran beneath the castle's stones. Ron and Hermione circled each other with an awkwardness that everyone could see, but neither could name. Ron took up with a girl named Lavender Brown, and Hermione hid her hurt behind stacks of books. And Harry, to his own surprise, found his eyes drawn again and again to Ginny Weasley, Ron's sister, whose laughter carried across the common room like something warm. He said nothing, for she was his best friend's sister, and the feeling frightened him almost as much as it pleased him. Yet beneath the small dramas of the young, a darker current moved. Draco Malfoy had changed. Where once he had been merely spiteful, he was now pale, thin, and haunted, vanishing for long stretches, missing meals, slipping away when he thought no one watched. Harry became convinced that Draco had been given some task by Voldemort, some terrible errand meant to prove himself, and he followed the boy through the corridors with a suspicion that no one else would share. Even Dumbledore, when Harry warned him, listened without alarm, as though he already understood more than he would say. For Dumbledore had begun to teach Harry a different lesson, one that had nothing to do with wands or spells. Through the long winter he summoned Harry to his office again and again, and each of these private meetings became a kind of lesson, unlike any other in the castle. In the quiet of that round tower room, beside a shallow stone basin that held silver memory like water, the old man and the boy traveled backward through time. Dumbledore had gathered memories from many people across many years, and one by one he showed them to Harry, so that together they might understand the enemy they faced. They watched a young woman, poor and unloved, cast a love potion upon a handsome muggle. They watched the child born of that broken union taken to an orphanage, a strange, cold boy who frightened the other children and gathered small stolen trophies. His name was Tom Marvolo Riddle, and Harry watched a much younger Dumbledore visit him and tell him he was a wizard, and saw already in the boy's still, hungry eyes the shape of the thing he would become. Through memory after memory, the picture deepened. They saw Riddle grown into a brilliant, charming student, beloved by teachers, hollow underneath. And then Dumbledore reached for a memory he did not possess in full, one that Slughorn had tampered with and hidden out of shame. It was the last piece, and Dumbledore asked Harry to retrieve it. For Slughorn, who guarded his own reputation like treasure, would give it to no one else. Harry understood then why Dumbledore had wanted Slughorn back at all. It took the whole year, and, in the end, a swallow of the lucky golden potion to loosen Slughorn's grip on his secret. Warmed by fortune and by fondness, the old professor at last surrendered the true memory. In it, a young riddle asked a question at a quiet gathering, a question about a kind of magic so dark that Slughorn had spent a lifetime wishing he had never answered it. Riddle wished to know whether a soul could be split, not once, but many times, and hidden away in separate vessels, so that its owner might never truly die. Dumbledore watched the memory with Harry and named the terrible thing at last. A fragment of soul, torn loose by murder and sealed inside an object, was called a Horcrux. And Voldemort, Dumbledore believed, had not made merely one. He had made several, scattering the pieces of himself across the world so that even if his body were destroyed, he could not die while a single fragment remained. This was the secret at the black heart of everything. The reason Voldemort had returned from ruin, the reason he could not simply be killed like an ordinary man. To end him, each hidden piece of his soul would first have to be found and destroyed. Dumbledore believed he had already found and destroyed 2 of these hidden fragments. One had been the diary of Tom Riddle, the very book that had opened the Chamber of Secrets years before, which Harry himself had pierced with a basilisk fang without ever understanding what it truly was. Another had been an old ring, a family heirloom of the Gaunts, which Dumbledore had broken at terrible cost to himself, for the withered blackness of his wand hand was the wound that ruin had left behind. Others remained hidden, and Dumbledore spoke of the shapes he suspected they might take, small treasured things that Voldemort would have chosen for their beauty or their history, objects worthy, in his cold pride, to hold a piece of his soul. Harry left the office that night changed once more. The whole vast war reshaped into a single, patient, impossible task. Somewhere in the world were the broken pieces of a man who had tried to make himself immortal. And only by finding them, one by one, could the darkness ever truly be undone. Up next in Chapter 14, The Cave, the Locket, and the Lightning-Struck Tower. We'll follow Harry and Dumbledore across black water to a hidden island and stand upon the highest tower of Hogwarts as a betrayal long in the making comes at last to pass. Dumbledore had learned, in the long patient work of memory, where one of the hidden fragments of Voldemort's soul might lie. And on a night near the end of the school year, he came to Harry and asked him to come along. He asked, too, for a promise that, whatever happened, whatever Dumbledore commanded, Harry would obey without question. Harry gave his word, and the 2 of them left the castle together and traveled far, until they stood upon a cliff above a cold and heaving sea. There, at the foot of the cliff, a fissure opened into the rock, and beyond it, a black tunnel led down into the dark. Dumbledore had guessed that Voldemort would return to this place because he had been here once as a boy, a cruel and frightened child brought on an orphanage outing, and here he had first tasted the pleasure of hurting the helpless. Long years later, he had come back to make it a hiding place for a piece of his soul, and he had guarded it with magic meant to punish anyone who dared follow. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, and across its still black lake there stood a small island lit by a faint, eerie green glow. To reach it, Dumbledore summoned a hidden boat, enchanted to carry only one grown wizard, though he judged that Harry, being young and untrained, would not count against the spell. They crossed the silent water together, and Harry saw, beneath the surface, pale shapes drifting, the bodies of those who had come before and never left. On the island stood a basin filled with a glowing potion, and within the potion, Dumbledore believed, lay the locket, a Horcrux. The potion could not be moved aside, nor cleared away, nor reached through. It could only be drunk. Dumbledore understood this at once, and he understood, too, what it would cost. He made Harry promise again, more firmly this time, that no matter how Dumbledore begged, no matter how he suffered, Harry would keep making him drink until every last drop was gone. It was a cruel promise to demand of a boy who loved him, and a crueler one to keep. Cup by cup, Harry gave the old man the potion, and cup by cup, the potion tore at him from within, filling him with memories of every terror and grief he had ever known, until Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age, wept and pleaded and cowered like a child. Still, Harry made him drink, because he had promised, and because there was no other way. When the basin was at last empty, the locket lay revealed, and Dumbledore lay broken and burning with thirst. Harry, desperate to give him water, scooped at the black lake, and the touch of his hand upon it woke the guardians of the water. The drifting dead rose, cold and countless, dragging themselves toward the island, and Harry could not fight so many. It was Dumbledore, gathering the last of his strength, who drove them back with a ring of fire, and together the two of them fled across the water and out of the cave into the clean night air. But they returned to a Hogwarts that was no longer safe. Above the castle, burning against the dark, hung the Dark Mark, the skull and serpent that Death Eaters cast over the places where they had killed. Dumbledore, weak and failing from the potion, hurried with Harry to the highest tower, and there Harry, hidden beneath his father's invisibility cloak and frozen by a whispered command from Dumbledore, was made to watch what he could not prevent. The door burst open, and Draco Malfoy came through it with his wand raised, pale and trembling. This had been his task all year, the terrible errand Harry had suspected, the thing that had hollowed him out. Voldemort had ordered the boy to kill Dumbledore, and had let a way into the castle be opened so that the Death Eaters might follow. Yet standing at last before the old man he had come to murder, Draco could not do it. Dumbledore spoke to him without fear and without anger, offering him mercy, offering to hide him and his whole family where Voldemort could never reach them. And for a long moment, the boy's wand wavered and began to lower. Then, the other Death Eaters crowded onto the tower behind him, and among them came Severus Snape. Dumbledore turned to Snape and spoke his name, and in that single word there was something that sounded almost like a plea. What passed between them, Harry could not understand. Snape raised his wand, and with two soft words of the killing curse, he struck Dumbledore down, and the greatest wizard of the age fell backward off the tower and into the night below. Released at last from the spell that had held him, Harry gave chase through the burning castle, past dueling teachers and fleeing enemies, out onto the grounds. He flung curse after curse at Snape as they crossed the dark lawns, but Snape turned each one aside almost lazily, and when Harry tried to use the prince's own invented spells against him, Snape blocked them with contempt, for he told Harry at the last, before he vanished into the night, that he himself was the half-blood prince, whose cleverness Harry had leaned upon all year long. The knowledge landed on Harry like a second grief. Dumbledore lay still upon the grass, and slowly the whole school gathered around him, and the fighting stopped, and one by one every wand was lifted into the air, casting a soft silver light up into the dark to drive away the Dark Mark and mourn the man who had protected them all. Hagrid wept. The castle seemed, for the first time in Harry's memory, to have lost its warmth. In the days that followed, they laid Dumbledore to rest beside the great lake, in a white marble tomb that gleamed in the summer light, and witches and wizards came from every corner of the land to grieve him, along with creatures of the water and the forest who had loved him in their own way. It was the first time in the long history of the school that a headmaster had been buried upon its grounds, and everyone who stood there understood that an age had ended. The protection that Dumbledore had woven about them all was gone, and the world that lay ahead would be darker and more dangerous than any these young people had ever known. Later, alone with his grief, Harry took out the locket they had suffered so much to win, the piece of soul they had crossed black water to claim, the object for which the greatest wizard of the age had drunk poison and been laid low. He turned it over in his hands, and he opened it. Inside there was no dark magic at all. There was only a small folded note, written in a stranger's hand. It said that the writer had discovered Voldemort's secret, had stolen the true Horcrux, and meant to destroy it, and that when Voldemort met his death at last, he would know that a braver man had reached him first. The note was signed only with 3 initials, R, A, and B, and Harry had no idea who that person might be. Somewhere out in the world, the real locket was hidden, and everything Dumbledore had died to accomplish had led only to a false one and a mystery. Yet, Harry did not despair. He understood now what his life was for. He would leave school, though the year of his education was not finished, and he would go out into the world to find the pieces of Voldemort's soul and destroy them, one by one, until the man who had killed his parents and his godfather and his teacher could be killed himself. He was not alone. Ron and Hermione had already told him, without being asked, that they would come. Up next in Chapter 15, The Flight of the 7 Potters, we'll leave Hogwarts behind and watch the war reach into the ordinary world as 7 brave friends take Harry's very face upon themselves to carry him through a sky full of enemies. Dumbledore was gone, and with him went the last great shield that had stood between the wizarding world and the dark. The summer that followed carried a heaviness that no sun could lift. At the Ministry of Magic, the government that had spent so long denying that Voldemort had ever returned now crumbled from within, hollowed out by fear and betrayal, and the quiet work of enemies planted in its highest offices. Everyone could feel it coming, the way one feels a storm before the first drop falls. It was only a question of when the last defenses would give way. Harry spent those final weeks back at Privet Drive, for the ancient protection his mother's sacrifice had laid upon that house would hold only until he came of age. On the day he turned 17, that old magic would break for good, and he would no longer be safe within those walls. The Order of the Phoenix, the secret society that had fought Voldemort in the first war and now gathered again for the second, understood the danger. They knew that on the very night the protection failed, Voldemort's followers would come for Harry, hoping to seize him or kill him before he could be moved to a stronger refuge. And so a plan was made, a daring and desperate one, to carry Harry away through the night sky before his enemies could reach him. Before that flight, Harry made his farewells to the only home he had ever truly known, if it could be called a home. The Dursleys, who had never loved him, were taken into hiding themselves, for Voldemort would not scruple to use them against him. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia left with barely a word, but young Dudley, who had spent a childhood tormenting his cousin, paused at the door and, in his clumsy way, showed something that might almost have been gratitude. It was not much, but it was more than Harry had ever expected, and he carried the small strangeness of it with him as the family drove away and left him alone in the empty house to wait for the order. They came that night, a whole company of them descending out of the dark, and among them were faces Harry loved. There were the Weasleys, and Hermione, and Remus Lupin, and Mad-Eye Moody, the grizzled old warrior who had survived 100 battles and trusted no one, and the young witch Nymphadora Tonks, and Mundungus Fletcher, a shifty little thief pressed reluctantly into service, and others besides. The plan Moody laid out was cunning and cruel in its simplicity. Voldemort's people would be watching for a single boy flown by a single guard along a single road, so there would be no single boy. 6 of Harry's friends drank a measure of polyjuice potion, brewed with a few of Harry's own hairs, and one by one their faces melted and reshaped until each of them wore Harry's face. Until the room was full of Harris, each dressed in identical clothes, each blinking through Harry's own glasses. It was a strange and unsettling thing to see, 7 of himself standing together in the lamplight. Then each false Harry was paired with a protector, and each pair would take a different route through the sky to a different safe destination, so that Voldemort's followers, seeing 7 Harrys scatter in 7 directions, would not know which to follow, and could not strike them all at once. Harry hated the plan, for it meant that 6 people he cared about would fly into danger wearing his face, drawing the enemy toward themselves for his sake. But he was overruled, and there was no time to argue. They rose into the night on brooms and on the backs of great winged creatures, and for a few heartbeats the sky was quiet and vast and full of stars. Then the darkness itself seemed to come alive. Death Eaters poured out of the black in every direction, dozens of them, cloaked and hooded and streaking through the air, and among them, worst of all, came Voldemort himself, flying without a broom, faster than any of them, his pale face terrible in the dark. The plan had been betrayed. Somehow, the enemy had known the very night, and now they fell upon the scattered pairs with curses that lit the sky in flashes of green and red. The true Harry rode with Hagrid in the sidecar of an enchanted flying motorcycle, and it was toward him, by some dark instinct, that the worst of the hunt was drawn. Curses tore past them. Hagrid steered wildly through the chaos, while Harry fought off the pursuers who closed in on every side. At one desperate moment, Harry's wand acted almost of its own accord, loosing a strange golden fire against Voldemort himself, a magic Harry did not understand and could not repeat, born of the deep and mysterious bond between his wand and the Dark Lords. It bought them a few seconds, no more. They fell and rose and fell again through the roaring dark, until at last, battered and half senseless, they crashed down into the safety of a protected garden, and the enchantments there closed over them like a door shutting out a storm. One by one, through the long, anxious night, the others came home. Some arrived hurt, some barely arrived at all. A curse had struck George Weasley in the flight and cost him an ear, and he bore it afterward with a joke and a brave face, though his family's fear had been terrible while they waited. Each returning pair brought its own tale of narrow escape, of curses dodged and pursuers outrun, and with each safe arrival, hope flickered a little higher, and the household dared to believe that perhaps, against all the odds, everyone might yet be counted alive. But not everyone came home. Mad-Eye Moody did not return, and neither did the wizard who had flown with him. Word came at last, carried on grief, that Moody had fallen in the sky, struck down by Voldemort in the thick of the fighting, his body lost to the night and never recovered. It was a heavy blow. Moody had been a legend, a survivor who had outlasted 100 younger men, the very picture of vigilance and endurance, and if even he could be killed, then no one was safe, and the war they faced was more terrible than any of them had let themselves imagine. The house that had rung with relief a moment before fell silent with mourning. In that silence, a colder truth settled over them all. The enemy had known the plan. Someone, somehow, had told, or been made to tell, and the careful secret had been laid bare. Trust itself became another casualty, for now no one could be quite certain how the betrayal had happened, and suspicion is a hard thing to carry among friends. Voldemort had shown, on this first true night of the war, that he could reach anywhere, know anything, strike without warning. The old comfort of walls and wands and loyal companions had grown thin, and the world Harry had known was passing away. There was grief, too, of a gentler kind mixed in with the terror of that night. For the young witch Tonks and the werewolf Remus Lupin, who had flown separately through the same storm, had grown close in the shadow of the war, and their quiet devotion to one another was one of the few tender things left to hold on to. Love, it seemed, still found a way to bloom even in the darkest season, and that small stubbornness of the heart was itself a kind of defiance against everything Voldemort stood for. Yet even in mourning, there was one small mercy to hold on to. Harry had been carried through the storm and delivered whole to safety, and the task Dumbledore had left him was not yet ended. There would be a brief pause, a gathering of breath, before he set out on the long and lonely road ahead. But the war had begun in earnest now, and there would be no turning back from it. Up next in Chapter 16, Three Friends on the Run, we'll watch a wedding turn to flight in a single terrible moment, and follow Harry, Ron, and Hermione as they vanish into the wild to begin the loneliest journey of their lives. For a little while after the flight through the night sky, there was an uneasy quiet, and into that quiet came a wedding. Bill Weasley, the eldest of the Weasley sons, was to marry Fleur Delacour, and the whole battered family threw itself into the preparations as though joy could be summoned by sheer will. A great white marquee was raised in the orchard, and flowers were charmed to bloom, and for one golden afternoon, the war was held at arm's length. Harry, who could not appear as himself for fear of the enemies searching for him, drank a little polyjuice potion and passed among the guests wearing the face of a red-haired village boy, a cousin invented for the day, so that he might stand among his friends and share, for a few hours, in something that was not fear. The wedding was warm and bright and full of laughter. There was music and dancing beneath the stars, and old friends embraced, and for a time it was possible to forget how thin the walls of that happiness truly were. Yet even amid the celebration, threads of the larger tale were quietly drawn. A strange old wizard spoke to Harry of a curious symbol, a mark he wore about his neck, and Harry did not yet understand its meaning, though it would matter greatly before the end. Such is the way of stories, that everything gathered along the road is needed eventually, and nothing is truly wasted. Then, in a single heartbeat, the golden afternoon shattered. A silver light came streaking through the sky above the dancers, a messenger of pure light shaped like a great cat, and it spoke with a voice everyone knew. It was the Patronus of Kingsley Shacklebolt, sent from far away, and it carried news no one wished to hear. The Ministry of Magic had fallen. The minister was dead. Voldemort's followers had seized the government at last, and even now they were coming. The message ended, and for a moment the whole gathering stood frozen in the sudden dark. And then the enchantments guarding the marquee gave way, and cloaked figures began to appear among the guests like shadows stepping out of the ground. There was no time for goodbyes. Hermione had planned for this very moment, though she had prayed it would not come. She seized Harry with one hand and Ron with the other, and turned on the spot. And the three of them vanished from the wedding and reappeared far away on a crowded, ordinary street in the heart of Muggle London, gasping, unhurt, and utterly alone. Behind them, the celebration had become a battlefield, and everyone they loved was left to face it without them. It was the hardest thing, to flee and leave the others behind. But Harry understood that he was the one Voldemort truly wanted, and that to stay would be to bring ruin down upon the whole family. So they ran, because running was the only way to protect anyone at all. From that day, the three friends became fugitives. They could not go home, for their homes were watched, and they could not trust the Ministry, for the Ministry now belonged to the enemy, and a new and cruel order was spreading across the land. Muggle-born witches and wizards were being hunted and questioned and stripped of their magic. Fear seeped into every corner of the wizarding world. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had only one another, a small beaded bag into which Hermione had cleverly packed everything they might need, and the vast and terrible task Dumbledore had left them, to find the hidden pieces of Voldemort's soul and destroy them, though they had almost no idea where those pieces might be, nor how such things could be destroyed at all. They took shelter where they could, in cafes and empty flats, and at last, in a house that had once belonged to Sirius, a grim old place in London that Harry had inherited. And it was there, piecing together clues and old memories, that they made a discovery both wonderful and dreadful. The stranger who had signed the false locket note with 3 initials, R, A, and B. The person who had stolen the true Horcrux long ago had a name at last. He was Regulus Black, Sirius's younger brother, a boy who had joined Voldemort and then turned against him and died trying to destroy him. And the real locket, the true fragment of Voldemort's soul, had passed through many hands and been stolen and sold and lost. And now they learned. It hung about the neck of one of Voldemort's cruelest servants at the very heart of the enemy Ministry. So the 3 friends did a mad and dangerous thing. Disguised by Polyjuice as Ministry workers, they walked straight into the enemy's stronghold, into the very building where their own faces were posted as wanted criminals, and they searched its cold marble halls until they found the locket and tore it free. Then they fled, snatching an innocent woman along with them in the chaos, and only just escaped with their lives, tumbling back out into the wilderness with the Horcrux at last in their keeping. But their refuge in London was compromised now, and they could never return to it. From that night on, they lived truly on the run, moving from one lonely camp to another, pitching a small enchanted tent in forests and on moors and beside cold gray rivers, never staying long, always watching the dark. They wore the locket in turns, for it could not be left unguarded, and it was a heavy burden in more than weight. The fragment of soul inside it was awake, and it hated them, and it fed upon their fears. Whoever wore it grew colder, more bitter, quicker to anger, and slower to hope. It whispered without words into the hearts of the ones who carried it, magnifying every doubt, every jealousy, every buried resentment, until 3 friends who had loved one another for years began to snap and quarrel over nothing at all. And they could not destroy the thing, for none of their spells could so much as scratch it, and they had no notion what weapon might. So they carried their enemy with them day after day, and it slowly poisoned the fellowship that was their only strength. Of the 3, it was Ron who suffered most under the locket's weight, for it knew exactly where to press. It played upon his oldest fear, that he was the least of them, overlooked and unloved, forever standing in the shadow of his famous friend. Hungry, cold, frightened for his family, and worn thin by a journey that seemed to lead nowhere, Ron reached at last the end of what he could bear. One bitter night the quarrel boiled over into words that could not be taken back, and Ron turned and walked out into the dark and the rain and did not come back. Harry and Hermione were left alone, and Hermione wept for days, and Harry felt the loss of his friend like a wound that would not close. The 3 had become 2, and the road ahead looked lonelier than ever. To ease their loneliness and their fear, Hermione taught Harry the old craft of vanishing without a trace, casting layer upon layer of protective enchantment about each new camp before they slept, so that no eye and no ear could find them in the dark. Each morning they packed the little tent away and moved on, changing the land beneath them, changing the sky above them, never resting long enough for the hunt to close its jaws. It was a wandering, watchful life, and it wore at them, and yet in its own strange way it also drew the two remaining friends closer, for they had no one in all the world now but each other. Yet they did not turn back. They went on together, the two of them, carrying the locket and the grief and the small, stubborn flame of hope that Dumbledore had lit in them. Somewhere ahead lay a way to destroy the thing they carried, and somewhere beyond that lay the other hidden pieces of Voldemort's soul, waiting in the dark to be found. The journey had only begun, and the winter was closing in. Up next in Chapter 17, The Hunt for the Horcruxes, we'll follow Harry and Hermione deeper into the wild, watch a lost friend find his way back through the snow, and learn at last how the pieces of a torn soul may be broken. And so the three friends went into hiding, carried into a world that had grown quiet and cold around them. With Dumbledore gone and the Ministry fallen into the shadow of Voldemort, there was no safe roof left beneath which they might rest. Harry, Ron, and Hermione moved from place to place beneath the enchanted tent that Hermione carried within her small beaded bag, a bag charmed to hold more than it ever should. Each night, they pitched the tent in a new corner of Britain, in windswept moorland, in the hush of a forest, beside a gray and murmuring river. Each morning they folded it away and vanished once more, leaving no trace behind them. Around Hermione's protective enchantments, the darkness pressed like water against glass. They were hunted now, and they knew it. The name of the Dark Lord had been made taboo, so that to speak it aloud was to summon his servants. They learned to hold their tongues. They learned to listen to the small wireless for the names of the dead, and to comfort one another in the long silences that followed. There was no post to bring them news, no friendly face to greet them, only the three of them and the wind and the endless turning of the days. Hermione had thought of everything, or nearly so. Into her small bag she had packed books and potions, spare clothes and a store of provisions, and the tent that unfolded into rooms far larger than its canvas should allow. She had woven charm upon charm about their camp each night, so that no eye could find them and no ear could hear. Yet no enchantment could keep out the slow ache of exile. They did not know how long they must live this way, nor where the quest would lead them, and the not knowing pressed upon them heavier than any storm. Their task had been given by Dumbledore before he died, and Dumbledore had left them so little to go upon, only riddles and half-answers and a trust that they would find the way. Between them, worn upon a chain against the skin, they carried the true locket. It was one of the fragments of Voldemort's torn soul, a Horcrux, and it did not rest quietly. Slytherin's locket had a weight to it that had nothing to do with gold, a coldness that seeped inward and turned bright thoughts gray. Whoever wore it grew sullen and heavy of heart, quick to see the worst, slow to hope. They took turns bearing it, and they watched the burden change each of them in its turn. It was Ron who felt it most keenly. He had left his family behind, and worry for them gnawed at him. His arms still ached where he had been hurt in their escape, and hunger followed them everywhere, for they had little food and no home. The locket found the tender places in him and pressed upon them, whispering that he was overlooked, unloved, unneeded. One bitter night, in the grip of that whispering darkness, Ron and Harry quarreled as they had never quarreled before. And Ron, believing himself unwanted, turned and walked out into the storm, and the enchantments closed behind him, and he was gone. The days that followed were the loneliest the two who remained had ever known. Harry and Hermione went on together, saying little, aching in a way that neither could name. Hermione wept in the dark when she thought Harry could not hear, and Harry kept the watch alone, staring out at the rain. They did not know where to go, nor what to do next, for every thread they followed seemed to lead only into deeper shadow. They knew the Horcruxes must be destroyed, but they had no means of destroying them, and no notion of where the others lay hidden. In time, their wandering carried them to a village Harry had longed all his life to see. Godric's Hollow, where he had been born, where his mother and father lay at rest. They went there on Christmas Eve, hidden beneath the old invisibility cloak, and they walked through the snow past the little church with its glowing windows. In the graveyard they found the grave of James and Lily Potter, and Harry stood before it a long while, and Hermione conjured a wreath of Christmas roses and laid it gently upon the frozen ground. The snow fell softly around them, and for a moment the war seemed very far away. But Godric's Hollow held a trap. An old woman met them in the dark lane, a woman Harry took at first for a friend, for she seemed to know his name and beckoned them toward a certain house. It was Bathilda Bagshot she claimed to be, the old historian who had lived there many years. Yet within the shuttered house, the truth uncoiled itself. For the thing that wore the old woman's shape was no woman at all. It was the great serpent Nagini, another vessel of the Dark Lord's soul, sent to lie in wait for the boy who was sure to come. The serpent struck, and the little house became a place of terror and shadow, and only by the narrowest of margins did Harry and Hermione break free into the night. In the struggle, Harry's wand, the wand of holly and phoenix feather that had served him faithfully since he was 11, was broken beyond mending. He grieved for it as one grieves for an old friend. Now they were poorer still and more frightened, and Harry felt the last of his certainties slipping away. Yet even in that darkest hour, a light came to them. One deep and frozen night, alone on the watch, Harry followed the gleam of a silver doe through the forest, a Patronus he did not know, gentle and shining, that led him to a pool sheathed in ice. And there, beneath the black water, lay the sword of Godric Gryffindor, the one weapon they knew could destroy a Horcrux. Harry broke the ice and plunged in after the sword, and the locket about his neck, sensing its own destruction near, tried to strangle him in the freezing dark. But out of the shadows, a friend returned. It was Ron, come back at last, who dragged Harry from the water and took up the fallen sword. The locket was laid upon the stone, and it fought them, for it knew Ron's fears and flung them at him in cruel and living visions. Yet Ron gathered his courage, and with the sword of Gryffindor he struck, and the fragment of soul within the locket screamed and died. One Horcrux was destroyed, and in that same act something between the friends was mended, and Ron was one of them once more. They did not speak much of what had passed. There was no need. Ron told them, haltingly, of how a small silver light that Dumbledore had left him had guided him back through the storm to the place where his friends were hidden, and how he had followed the doe's tracks and the sword's gleam until he found them. Harry forgave him without a word, and Hermione, after a while, forgave him too, and the old ease slowly returned among them. The three of them sat together in the tent as the fire burned low, and for the first time in many weeks, a small warmth returned to their hearts. The road ahead was still long, and the enemy still strong, and they carried yet no clear map through the dark. But they were three again, and that made all the difference. Outside, the snow went on falling, soft and endless, over the sleeping hills of Britain, and beneath its white silence, the tired travelers rested, gathering what strength they could for the trials still to come. And as they sat wondering how the pieces of their strange quest might fit together, an old book that Dumbledore had left to Hermione lay, waiting to be opened, and within it slept a very old story indeed. Up next, in Chapter 18, The Tale of the Three Brothers, we'll follow that ancient tale into the mystery of the Deathly Hallows and learn of the wand, the stone, and the cloak that together are said to master death itself. The book that Dumbledore had left to Hermione in his will was a small and battered thing, a collection of children's tales written in the old runes of the wizarding world. It was called The Tales of Beetle the Bard, and generations of magical children had been lulled to sleep by its pages. Yet one of its stories held a meaning far deeper than any nursery rhyme, and it was to that story the three friends now turned, seeking a light to guide them through the dark. They had come, by a winding road, to the home of Xenophilius Lovegood, the eccentric father of their friend Luna. Upon his robes, he wore a curious symbol, a triangle enclosing a circle, crossed down the middle by a single straight line. Harry had seen that same mark elsewhere, drawn in the margins of the old book, and it troubled him. And so, gathered in the strange round house upon the hill, they asked what the symbol meant. In answer, Hermione was asked to read the old tale aloud, and she opened the book and began, and the story unfolded like a slow and solemn dream. Once, the tale went, three brothers were traveling together at twilight along a lonely road. They came at last to a river too deep to wade and too dangerous to swim, a river that had drowned many travelers before them. But being wizards, the three brothers simply raised their wands and made a bridge of the empty air and set out to cross. Yet halfway over, they found their path blocked by a hooded figure. It was Death himself, and Death was angry, for the river had been one of his snares, and these three had slipped it by their cleverness. Cunning and hiding his displeasure, Death pretended to be pleased. He congratulated the brothers and offered each of them a prize for having eluded him. The eldest brother, a proud and warlike man, asked for a wand more powerful than any in the world, a wand that would always win its master victory in any duel. And so, Death broke a branch from an elder tree that stood upon the riverbank and fashioned it into a wand and gave it to the eldest. The second brother, a haughty and arrogant man, wished to humble Death further still, and so he asked for the power to call the dead back from beyond. And Death took a small stone from the riverbed and gave it to him, and told him the stone would have the power to raise the dead. Then the youngest brother, who was the humblest and the wisest of the three, did not trust Death at all. He asked for something that would let him leave that place without being followed, and so Death, most unwillingly, handed over his own cloak of invisibility. Then the three brothers went their separate ways, and each carried his gift toward his own fate. The eldest traveled to a distant village, and there, full of the power of the elder wand, he sought out a wizard with whom he had once quarreled, and struck him down. Drunk with the wand's power, he boasted that night of the unbeatable weapon he had won from Death himself. And in the dark, while he lay sleeping, another crept in and cut his throat and took the wand for his own. And so Death took the first brother for his own as well. The second brother went to his lonely home, and there he took up the little stone and turned it 3 times in his hand. To his amazement, there appeared before him the shape of the woman he had once hoped to marry, who had died before her time. Yet she was sad and cold and separated from him as though by a veil, for she did not belong among the living. She had returned in body and not in truth, and the longing of it drove the second brother to despair, until at last he took his own life to join her in truth. And so Death took the second brother too. But the third and youngest brother, Death searched for many years and never found, for he had wrapped himself in the cloak of invisibility and gone quietly through the world unseen, hidden even from Death. Only when he had grown very old did he take off the cloak at last and give it to his own son. And then he greeted Death as an old friend and went with him gladly, as equals, departing this life in peace. Such was the tale of the three brothers. When Hermione had finished reading, a hush fell over the little room. And then they were told the meaning that some believed lay hidden within it. The three gifts of death were not mere invention. They were the deathly hollows, three objects that truly existed somewhere in the world. The unbeatable Elder Wand, passed from hand to hand down the long centuries, always by conquest, always leaving death in its wake. The Resurrection Stone, that could summon the shades of the dead. And the Cloak of Invisibility, true and everlasting, that would hide its wearer from any eye. And it was said that the witch or wizard, who united all three, who possessed the wand and the stone and the cloak together, would become the master of death. Harry sat very still, for the tale had stirred something deep and strange within him. He thought of the old cloak he had carried since his first Christmas at Hogwarts, the cloak handed down through his father's family, that never wore thin and never failed, that had hidden him faithfully year after year, while other cloaks of its kind grew ragged and lost their power. He thought of a small, cracked stone set in a ring, which he had glimpsed in Dumbledore's memories, and of how the old headmaster had spoken of it with a strange and wistful longing. He thought, too, of the symbol drawn again and again in the margins of the little book, and of the mark upon Xenophilius Lovegood's robes, and he began to wonder whether these were only stories after all, or whether some old and secret truth lay hidden beneath the words. Ron and Hermione were uneasy, for the tale had unsettled them as well. Hermione, ever the careful one, mistrusted such legends and warned that to chase after the Hallows was to be lured from the true path. Ron, for his part, half believed, for he had grown up on these stories at his mother's knee, and something in him thrilled to think they might be real. And Harry listened to them both and turned the matter over and over in his mind through the long nights that followed. Slowly, in the days that followed, a fearful understanding took shape in his mind. Harry saw now that there were two paths laid before him through the darkness. One was the path of the Horcruxes, the hunt he had sworn to Dumbledore he would finish, the slow and dangerous work of destroying the fragments of the Dark Lord's soul. The other was the path of the Hollows, the temptation of power, the promise of mastery over death itself. And he came to see that the two were bound together, two ways through the same great shadow. For Harry understood at last what Voldemort himself was seeking. The Dark Lord, in his terror of dying, had heard of one hollow above the others, and it was the Elder Wand he now desired, the wand that could not lose. Somewhere in the wide world Voldemort was hunting for that unbeatable weapon, believing it the key to his final victory, tracing its bloody path down the centuries from one master to the next. And Harry knew, with a quiet and terrible certainty, that his own road and the Dark Lord's were drawing together toward a single point. The two paths, the Hallows and the Horcruxes, wound closer with every passing day, and Harry sensed that soon there would be no more hiding, no more wandering in the wilderness. Soon he would have to turn and face what waited for him. Up next in Chapter 19, The Battle of Hogwarts, we'll follow that road through capture and daring escape to the gates of the old school itself, where the last battle waits, where a long-hidden loyalty is revealed, and where Harry must face the darkest choice of all. The road that Harry had foreseen led first into the hands of the enemy. Snatchers took the three friends in the woods and carried them to Malfoy Manor, that cold and shadowed house where the Dark Lord's servants gathered. There, Bellatrix Lestrange questioned Hermione with terrible cruelty, while Harry and Ron were locked away in the cellar below. Yet, in that dark place they were not alone, for others were held prisoner there, and among them, come to their aid, was Dobby the house elf, freed long ago and faithful still. By the elf's strange and sudden magic, they were spirited out of the cellar and up into the drawing room, and a desperate struggle followed. In the end, they escaped, all of them, carried away by Dobby's power. But the little elf had been struck as they vanished, and he died in Harry's arms upon a windswept shore, free and brave to the last. Harry dug his grave by hand, without magic, and grief settled over them like the falling dusk. They buried Dobby above the sea, in a grave marked with a small stone, and Harry felt the loss of the little elf as keenly as any he had known, for Dobby had loved him freely and asked nothing in return. In the quiet of that grief, a new clarity came to Harry, and he set aside the temptation of the Hollows and turned his whole heart once more to the hunt for the Horcruxes, the task Dumbledore had trusted to him. From that sorrow, they turned to a daring deed. They had learned that another Horcrux, a golden cup that had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, lay hidden in the deepest vault of Gringotts, the wizard's bank, guarded within the vault of the Lestranges among heaps of treasure. With cunning and disguise and no small amount of luck, the three broke into that vault, past dragon and enchantment and a mountain of cursed and multiplying gold. They seized the cup, and to win their freedom, they climbed upon the back of the great blind dragon that guarded the bank's depths, and rode it up and out into the open sky, and away over the hills of Britain. Then, Harry knew, through the strange window in his mind that linked him to the Dark Lord's thoughts, where the last of the Horcruxes must be. It was at Hogwarts. And to Hogwarts they went, back to the old school that had been the nearest thing to a home Harry had ever known. But the castle was a castle no longer at peace. The Death Eaters held it, and fear ruled its halls. Yet within its walls the members of the old resistance still gathered in secret, and when Harry came among them, the word spread from heart to heart, and the school rose up. Teachers and students, the Order of the Phoenix, and every soul who still loved the light took up their places, and the ancient enchantments of the castle were raised against the coming storm. The Battle of Hogwarts had begun. As the fighting raged, Harry sought the lost Horcrux, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, and found it at last in the vast forgotten Room of Requirement, where it was unmade in a rush of cursed fire. One by one, the fragments of the Dark Lord's soul were falling. The cup was destroyed by Hermione and Ron with a basilisk fang drawn from the Chamber of Secrets. And in the midst of the battle, Harry came upon a truth he had never expected, a truth that would change everything he believed. For he witnessed the end of Severus Snape, whom he had long taken for an enemy and a murderer. As Snape lay dying, he gave to Harry a silver strand of memory, and begged only to be looked at, so that a mother's eyes might be the last thing he saw. In the pensieve, those memories at last revealed the truth. Snape had loved Lily Potter, Harry's mother, since they were children together, and had never ceased to love her. When she died, it broke him, and in secret grief and penance, he had turned against the Dark Lord and served Dumbledore faithfully for all the long years since. Even the killing of Dumbledore upon the tower had been done at Dumbledore's own asking. A mercy planned between them to spare the old man a crueler death and to shield another soul. Snape had guarded Harry all along, watched over him, and sent the silver doe that led him to the sword. His loyalty had been true from first to last, and no one had known. And there was more, and it was the hardest truth of all. Harry learned that on the night his mother died, a piece of Voldemort's shattered soul had lodged within Harry himself. He was, without ever knowing it, the last living Horcrux. And so long as that fragment lived within him, the Dark Lord could not truly die. Harry understood then what he must do. He must let Voldemort strike him down. He must walk to his own death willingly, so that the peace of soul he carried might perish with him and the Dark Lord be made mortal once more. It was the bravest and the loneliest choice that any could be asked to make. Harry did not tell his friends, for he knew they would try to stop him. And he knew, too, that this was a road he must walk alone. He thought of all who had died so that he might live, of his mother and father, of Sirius and Lupin, of Dobby and so many more, and he understood that his own life had always been meant for this. He was not afraid, or if he was, he set the fear aside, and he made himself ready. And so Harry walked. He went alone into the forbidden forest, quiet and unafraid, though every step was heavy. Along the way he turned the resurrection stone 3 times in his hand, and there came to him the gentle shades of those he had loved and lost, his mother and his father, Sirius and Lupin, walking beside him in the dark, giving him courage to go on. At the heart of the forest Voldemort waited, and Harry did not raise his wand. The green light came, and Harry fell. Yet death did not keep him. In a place beyond the world, bright and still like a great empty station, Harry met Dumbledore once more, and learned that because the Dark Lord had used Harry's own blood to return, a thread of Harry's life still bound Voldemort to the living world. And so Harry might choose to go back. And Harry chose to return. He came back to the battle to finish what had begun. The Dark Lord believed the boy destroyed, but Hogwarts had not fallen, and its defenders rose once more. And in the great hall at the last, before all the watching world, Harry faced Voldemort alone. He spoke plainly of Snape's true loyalty, of the Elder Wand and its hidden allegiance, for the wand had never truly belonged to Voldemort at all. Its master was Harry. When Voldemort cast the killing curse one final time, it rebounded from the wand that would not turn against its rightful owner, and the Dark Lord fell by his own hand at last and did not rise again. The long shadow lifted. Dawn broke over Hogwarts, and the castle, battered and grieving, stood. There was joy in that morning, but it was a quiet joy, wrapped in sorrow. Many had been lost, and the living held one another and wept for the fallen even as they gave thanks. Friends who had fought through the night sat together in the great hall as the sun rose, weary beyond words, and looked upon one another with wonder that they had lived to see the dawn. The Elder Wand, that unhappy relic of death's first gift, Harry chose not to keep for himself, for he had seen the ruin it brought to all who craved it, and he wished no such power. The war was over. The Dark Lord was gone, and would not come again. The long night of fear had ended, and the morning, though heavy with grief, was a morning of freedom at last. Up next in Chapter 20. A gentle dawn, 19 years later, will leave the smoke of battle behind and follow the slow healing of the years to a bright morning upon a familiar platform where the story comes softly and at last to rest. When the last echoes of battle had faded, the dust settled slowly over Hogwarts, and the long work of healing began. The great hall, so lately a place of struggle and grief, became a place of quiet mourning. The fallen were laid to rest and remembered with love, each name spoken softly, each life honored. There were those who would be missed for all the years to come, friends and teachers and brave young souls who had given everything so that the light might endure. And though the sorrow was deep, there was comfort in it too. The comfort of knowing that their courage had not been spent in vain. Harry himself walked the ruined halls in those first quiet days and mourned with the rest, and yet felt too a strange and gentle lightness, as of a long-held breath finally released. The thing that had lived inside him for so long was gone, and he was wholly himself at last. In the days that followed, The wizarding world drew a long breath and began, gently, to mend. The Death Eaters who remained were gathered up, and the reign of fear came to its end. The Ministry of Magic, so long twisted by the Dark Lord's shadow, was cleansed and set right, and honest hands took up its care. The prison of Azkaban gave back the innocent who had been wrongly held. Word went out across the country that Voldemort was gone, truly and forever, and slowly the fear that had gripped so many hearts loosened and fell away. Children who had been kept home returned to their schools. Families long parted found one another again. The castle of Hogwarts, battered but unbroken, was repaired stone by stone, and in time its towers rose whole once more against the sky, and its halls filled again with laughter and learning. For Harry, the years brought a peace he had never known in all his childhood. The burden he had carried since before he could remember was lifted at last. The scar upon his forehead, that old mark of a night he could not recall, grew quiet and never pained him again. He no longer dreamed the dark dreams. He no longer woke in the night listening for danger. He was simply a young man now, free to live, free to love, free to build a life of his own choosing. And so he did. Harry married Ginny Weasley, whose bright courage had shone beside him through the darkest days, and together they made a home full of warmth. Ron and Hermione, who had walked every step of the long road at Harry's side, found their own happiness together as well, and the bonds of friendship that had been forged in danger only deepened in the quiet years of peace. The great family of the Weasleys, who had opened their door to a lonely boy so long ago, grew larger and gladder with each passing season. There were birthdays and weddings, small joys and gentle mournings, the ordinary blessings that a hard-won peace allows. The children came in their turn, and the house filled with the sound of small feet and bright laughter. Harry, who had grown up unwanted and unloved in a cupboard beneath the stairs, gave to his own children all the tenderness he had never known himself. He watched them grow and told them stories by the fire, and loved them with a fullness that healed the old wounds of his childhood at last. Ginny watched him with quiet joy, for she had seen how far he had come, from the haunted boy of the war to the gentle father he had become. And when Harry looked upon his family, gathered warm and safe about him, he understood that this, and not any wand or stone or cloak, was the truest thing that life could offer. The names of the fallen were spoken often in that house, with love and not with grief, so that the children knew whose courage had made their happiness possible. And the years went by, unhurried and kind, each one a small gift. The years turned softly, one into the next, until 19 of them had passed. And on a bright morning in early autumn, a family made its way through the bustle of a great railway station in London. It was the 1st of September, the day when the young witches and wizards of Britain set out once more for Hogwarts, and King's Cross was crowded with travelers who saw nothing at all unusual in the little group hurrying by. They came to the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and one after another they passed through it, unseen by the ordinary world, onto the hidden platform beyond. There stood the scarlet Hogwarts Express, gleaming and grand, its engine breathing soft white steam into the cool morning air. Platform 9 3/4 was alive with the sounds of a new school year beginning. The calling of farewells, the hooting of owls, the rattle of trolleys piled high with trunks, the eager chatter of children. Harry was there, older now, with a few silver threads in his dark hair and a gentle calm about him. Ginny walked at his side. With them were their children, ready for the great adventure that Harry himself had once begun upon this very platform. Their eldest son was already an old hand at going away to school, and teased his younger brother, who stood nervous and wide-eyed. worried about which house he might be sorted into. Harry knelt beside the boy and comforted him softly, telling him that whichever house welcomed him would be proud to have him, and that the choice, should he wish it, would honor his own heart. The boy took heart at that, and the worry eased from his small face. Nearby stood Ron and Hermione with their own children, and the two families greeted one another with the easy warmth of a friendship that had never faltered. There were smiles and embraces, last reminders and gentle laughter, the small and precious rituals of a family mourning. Old friends waved across the crowded platform. A new generation, born into a world made safe, chattered and fidgeted and gazed up at the great red engine with shining eyes, knowing nothing of the darkness their parents had endured, and needing to know nothing of it, for that was the whole purpose of what had been done. At last the whistle sounded, long and clear, and the children climbed aboard. Harry and Ginny and Ron and Hermione stood together upon the platform and watched as the scarlet train began to move, gathering speed, carrying their sons and daughters away toward the castle in the hills where they themselves had once learned and grown and found each other. Small faces pressed to the windows, waving, and the parents waved back until the last carriage curved out of sight and the steam drifted slowly apart upon the morning air. Harry stood a while longer, his hand raised, a quiet smile upon his face. He thought of all the long road that had brought him here, of the friends who had walked it beside him and the ones who had fallen along the way, of the boy in the cupboard who could never have dreamed of a morning so gentle as this. He thought of his mother and father, who had died to save him upon a night he could not remember, and he knew that they would have been glad to see this morning, and glad of the peace their sacrifice had bought. He thought of Dumbledore, and of Sirius, and of all the teachers and friends who had guided and guarded him, and he felt them near, not as sorrow, but as a gentle presence woven into the calm of the day. The old pain was gone. His hand strayed once to the scar upon his forehead, out of long habit, but it did not hurt, and it had not hurt for 19 years. The train was gone. The platform was quiet. The autumn light lay soft and golden over everything, over the empty rails and the drifting steam and the small band of old friends who lingered a moment longer in the calm of the morning before turning at last for home. The story that had begun on a dark night so many years before, with a lightning scar and an orphan child left upon a doorstep, had come round now to this bright and gentle dawn. The boy who had lived was a man grown, at peace, surrounded by love, and the world he had helped to save lay safe and quiet around him. There was nothing more to fear and nothing left to do but live and love and rest. And all was well. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed a boy who lived, and the letters that no cupboard could keep from him, and a giant who carried him into a hidden world of gold and wands and a scarlet train. We watched him sorted into Gryffindor and guard a hidden stone, hear whispers within a chamber deep beneath the castle, and face the great serpent with a borrowed sword. We followed a prisoner thought guilty and a godfather found at last, a goblet of fire and a tournament he never chose, and a graveyard where an old darkness rose again. We saw an army gathered in secret, a battle in a hall of prophecy, and a quiet loss that taught him grief. We followed a half-blood prince and a cave beneath dark water, a tower struck by lightning, and 7 friends who flew through the night to keep him safe. We watched 3 friends wander alone, a locket destroyed, an old tale of 3 brothers, and a last battle in a castle that would not fall. And we came, at the end, to a gentle dawn, and to a life made whole 19 years on, upon a familiar platform, with all at last well. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet valley. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.